In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to build a fully fledged production-ready authentication system in Next.js entirely from scratch. That means no third-party libraries at all. This system is going to handle email and password-based authentication, how do you handle your session-related information, and it's also going to handle OAuth information, and you can sign in with any OAuth provider that you want. The system I'm going to show you works with all of them. On top of that, I have a ton of different diagrams that I'm going to go through that show you exactly how all these different authentication and authorization systems work, from a basic sign-in all the way to a really complicated OAuth sign-in process, so you can truly understand the nitty-gritty of everything that's going on behind the scenes. Also, I'm going to be splitting my code into two different sections. I have the core authentication and the Next.js specific stuff. That means even if you've never touched Next.js, you've never used React, or even if you don't even write JavaScript code, it doesn't matter because all the stuff I show you in the core section is going to work with any language and any framework you want to use. The Next.js specific section, which is quite small, is the stuff that you need to do to hook up all this core logic with Next.js itself. So this is going to be a massive video. It's just essentially a gold mine of everything related to authentication that I know, all crammed into one video. I guarantee by the time you're done with this video, you can have a fully fledged authentication system in your application. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name is Kyle and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. And before we start diving into all of these different diagrams that I have about authentication, I do want to mention that this video is sponsored by Clerk. They're a company that makes setting up authentication in your application incredibly easy, and it comes with a ton of incredibly powerful features such as multi-tenant authentication, which is very, very complicated to set up and to get working properly. Now don't worry, nothing in this video actually means that you need to use Clerk. Like I said, everything is going to be entirely free of third-party services, but if you realize by watching this video that maybe you don't want to implement your own auth system because it can get quite complex, or maybe your authentication needs are beyond what I can show you in this basic video, Clerk is a really great tool out there to do authentication, and I'm really glad that they were able to sponsor this video, even though I'm going to essentially show you how to create a somewhat competitor to Clerk itself. So diving into these actual diagrams, the first thing I want to talk about is how the actual sign-up process works inside of a generic application, specifically our application, but this is going to work for pretty much any application. You have three different sections in your application. You have the client, so the person accessing your website. You have the server where your own code is running, and then you have the database where you're storing your user information. So the first thing that happens is someone comes to your sign-up form and they enter all the sign-up related information. So for example, email, password, name, or anything else they need to sign up to your application. Then you get to your server, and when you get to the server, what's going to happen is your server is going to verify all the data is there. Did they enter an email? Did they enter a password? Is their name correct? And so on. It's going to take the password and it's going to hash that password. Essentially what it means is it's going to take a password, such as password, and it's going to convert it to just a really long string of characters and numbers, just a massive gobbledygook of information, and that is what's going to be saved in your database. And this is not a hash that can actually be decrypted, so you're not encrypting this data, you're specifically hashing it, which is a one-way encryption. It means you can only encrypt it and you can never decrypt this thing. That's very important for password security. Then we save that information to our database. So we send along our email and our hash password and name and anything else, insert that data, and then we get that user ID back. Now here is where the important step comes in. This is very similar across all different authentication methods. What we're going to do is we're going to create a user session. And the session essentially allows us to correspond a particular user with the actual logged in person on the client. So when we create a session, what we're going to do is we're going to take information such as our user ID and our role, and we're going to put that into our session. And we're going to get returned to us a random ID, this brand new ID for our session. And that session ID is what we save inside of a cookie. That way, when someone comes back to our website and tries to make a request, so for example, they want to access their dashboard, it's going to send along that session cookie, which has the ID, and we can use that ID to look them up inside of our session storage and get back their user ID and role and whatever other information we have about this user we can get back. So essentially what happens is we take all the information from the user on the client, we hash their password and save that in our database. Then what we do is we create a unique identifier for that user. We save it inside of the cookie so that way every time they make a request, we know which user it's going to be. And then in the database or somewhere else, we're going to be storing what that particular session is. Now the sign-in process is essentially the exact same as sign-up. The only main difference here is that instead of saving the user in the database, you're taking something like their email and you're getting the user from the database, and then you're going to verify that the password that they pass into their form is the exact same password that they passed in before. So what you're going to do is you're going to take that hashed password and then you're going to hash their password they typed in and check to make sure they're both equal. Again, I'm going to show you how to do all this stuff. So once we have that their password is verified and everything is correct, then we just do our session stuff just like before. This bottom half is exactly the same as when we did our sign up process. And this is how you do a standard email password-based authentication. And this is actually relatively simple to set up. It's not too complicated, and I'll show you how that works. The next type of authentication we have is going to be JWT, which stands for JSON Web Token. Now, I'm not going to specifically be covering JSON Web Tokens in this video because for 99% of applications, they cause more problems than they actually solve. You generally don't need a JSON Web Token for your security purposes, and they only have a few benefits, which I will talk about the pros and cons of them. But the actual process for JWTs is pretty much exactly the same. You can see we sign in, we get their data, we get the user from their email, we verify their password, all of that's the same. The only difference is instead of storing a session in something like a database or a Redis in-memory store, we're instead creating a JSON Web Token. And this is just like an encrypted piece of data that stores things like their user ID and their role, and then we save that inside the cookie. So now when people make requests to our server, we have that JWT, which we can decrypt to get their information from. So if we take a look here at the authorized way that things happen, someone makes a request, we get the session cookie, we get the session ID from it, we access our database, and that gives us information for our user. We can verify if they have permission and then send them back their information. Now in the case of a JWT, it's essentially the exact same thing. They make a request on the client, we send along the session cookie, which in our case contains that JWT, and then we decode that to get the user ID and role, and we verify their permissions. So the big difference between these two is you'll notice there's no database step when we authorize a JSON Web Token, while to authorize someone using a session cookie, we need to access the database or some other type of memory storage. Now, if we look down here, I kind of have a little bit of a diagram on where you want to store your session. So are you using a JSON Web Token? That is the JSON Web Token way of doing things. Are you using a database and storing a session ID, or are you using an in-memory store such as Redis? Now, in my opinion, for most applications, all you really need is either a database or an in-memory store such as Redis to store a session ID, and that's going to work for most applications and give you lots of benefits. The main reason that I say that JSON Web Tokens are generally not necessary for your application is because they don't add a ton of benefits, but they do add a lot of extra implementation overhead. Now, the very most basic form of a JSON Web Token is not too hard to implement. But to implement a JSON Web Token properly with access tokens and refresh tokens to make sure things are secure and having a short access token lifetime, that requires a ton of extra overhead in your code. And the only benefits that you really get from a JSON Web Token is, first of all, you don't have to access the database, which means that your request speed is very quick because you don't need to make that slow connection to a database. But using something like Redis can be pretty much as fast as the encryption and decryption of a JSON Web Token. It'll never be as fast, but it can be quite close to as fast as that. Now, the downside of a JSON Web Token is you cannot revoke someone's session, and this is what makes the implementation much more difficult. Because if we go back up to this section here where we authorize, you'll notice we never actually do anything with checking a database to see if this JSON Web Token is good. All we do is we decode the JSON Web Token we get, and as long as everything in there is valid, it's a valid JSON Web Token. So if your web token lasts for, let's say, 7 days, anyone that has access to that web token can pretend to be you for 7 days, and there's no way for you to prevent that because there's no place that we check a database. That's why session storage is nice, because you can just delete that row from the database, and now even if someone else has your session ID, they cannot authenticate as you. So that's why JSON Web Tokens have that big drawback, and to get around that drawback, you either have to lose all of the benefits by storing things in a database, or you have a lot of extra implementation overhead. The other only real benefit of a JSON Web Token is, since you decrypt it on the server and you don't have to access a database or anything like that, it means you can read this JSON Web Token in the client, it means you can read it on other servers, and you don't need access to that original database. But again, you have problems with revoking sessions, so you have pros and cons. I would say 99.9% of the time, you just need a memory store that's going to store your session ID in something like Redis, or even inside of a database, and you can see we get pretty much all of the same benefits. The only thing we really don't get is the ability to read this anywhere. But unless you're doing a multi-server application, you really don't need the ability to read your JSON Web Token anywhere. Now, I know I've been dumping a ton of information at you, so let's actually dive into the code to see what this looks like. And I have a little bit of starting code that we can work with. There's actually nothing really in here related to authentication, but I can kind of show you what just the base boilerplate starting code looks like. You can see here we have a sign-in page and a sign-up page. When I click sign in, you can see I enter my email password. And if I click sign up, you can see I have a name field at the top, and that's the only additional field inside of here. Now, if we really quickly look at the code that we have, we can see inside of our source folder, we actually have quite a bit of code inside here, but most of it's not really implemented other than these few different pages we have. If we go into our page.tsx, we can take a look at this, and you can see right here, I just have my buttons for sign in and sign out if we don't have a user. And if we do have a user, I'm showing some information down here. So we can kind of just hard code what a user would look like so we can see that. And you can see I get a user that says Kyle. It tells me what my role is, whether I'm an admin or not, because I'm going to be covering that related information as well. And then you can see we can access a private page, which will eventually allow me to toggle between an admin and a normal user. And I also have an admin page as well, which we're going to make sure that we restrict to only people with admin access. So we have a lot of different stuff we're going to be covering with permissions and so on. So we have all of that. So that's what this page does. It really just shows my sign-in links, or it shows what my user that's signed in is. Again, the design of this page doesn't matter because I'm not covering that. I'm just talking about the authentication workflow. Other than that, you can see here our sign-in page is super simple. We just render a sign-in form. Sign-up page, same thing. We render our sign-up form. Our admin page, super bare bones. It just has a button to go home. And our private page here is pretty much basic. We have here a button that allows us to toggle the role, which we'll implement in a little bit, and a button to go back home. So overall, really quite simple. This auth folder right here is where most of the magic in our application comes in. We can have a core folder, which currently has nothing because there's no authentication built into this application. And then we have a Next.js folder. This has a logout button, which calls our logout action. We have a sign in form, which calls our sign in action. This is just a boilerplate shadcn form. Same thing here with sign up, boilerplate shadcn form that calls our sign up function. And all of the code for this will be linked in the description below, so you can check it all out and look at it all more in depth if you want. But I don't think it's super important for me to go through the actual design of these forms because that does not matter. That's not the important part of this video. Now inside of our actions, you can see we have a sign in, sign up, and logout action. So far, all that they're doing is they're getting our data and they're converting it to the correct type, whether it's email password or here, you can see we have our name field inside of here. So it's just converting that to the correct type, but we haven't implemented any of our logic yet. And then here's our schemas just to make sure that we have our data in the correct form. So our sign-in schema has email password and sign up has name email password. Lastly, I should mention that we're using Drizzle for our database. So we have a really simple schema here with a user table, name, email, password. We have a salt, which is something we're going to talk about when we deal with authentication because you need that to hash your password. And then finally, we have a role table to determine if we're an admin or a user with a specific role. Also, I'm going to be using Redis inside of this application as well. I'm currently hosting it on Upstash. It really doesn't matter where you host your Redis instance, and you may not even need a Redis instance because you can just store your session directly in your database, but Redis is generally going to be quicker than a database lookup, which is why I think storing your session in Redis is generally preferable over a database session storage, but they both work fine. Next.auth, for example, uses your database for session storage, so clearly it can work any way that you want it to. It's entirely up to your particular needs. So the very first thing I want to work on is what our sign up page is going to look like. So we can come over into our Next.js, we can go to our actions, and we can look at sign up, and I want to figure out what our logic is going to be. So as long as we have data, the very first thing I want to do is determine if we have an existing user. So I'm going to get that specifically from my database. Let's make sure we import all these different rows. And all I'm doing is I'm accessing my database table and I'm determining, hey, is there a user with this email already in the database? If there is an existing user, I just want to return an error that says the account already exists for this email and return, because obviously you can't sign up with the same email multiple times. Then the next thing I want to do is I actually want to create and sign up my user. And this is where all of our more core related code is going to go, because we need to not only hash our password, we also need to make sure we generate salt for the password and then obviously insert the user into our database. So let's go into that core folder that we have. So core right here, I'm going to create a brand new file and we're going to call this password hasher.ts. And inside of here, I'm going to export a function called hash password. And this is going to take in my password as well as a salt. Make sure I get all my typing correct. There we go. And the salt is essentially just going to be a random string of characters that we use to make sure our password cannot be guessed. Because the way that password hashing works is, let's say that my password is just the text password. Well, when I run it through my hashing algorithm, it's going to return to me something. Let's say this is what it returns to me, 123, 123, 123. And that's going to always be the same. Every time you hash password, it always returns to you 123, 123, 123, no matter what. The reason that we add a salt in is because that's going to take a random characters and it's just going to add them onto our password. That way, when we hash this, it's going to be different. So the first time that we hash password, our salt may just be the text salt. So it's going to look something like this, and it's going to convert to some value, 245, whatever. And then the next time we hash the exact same password for someone else, we're going to pass on some new salt. And now, of course, our hashed version of this is going to be entirely different. This makes it so it's impossible for people to guess your password if they get access to the hashed version. Because again, every time you hash something, it always returns the same value. So if some malicious hacker gets access to your hashed password, they know what the unhashed version is. but by throwing in completely random data, which is what our salt is, that's going to make sure that they cannot convert from this hashed value to our actual password. So to implement this, it's actually really easy. It's entirely built into Node.js. We just need to import the crypto library. So we can come in here and import crypto, and that's from the crypto library. Crypto, just like that. And this is, again, entirely built into Node.js. This isn't a third-party library or anything like that. And the way that crypto works is it has something called scrypt. You may have heard of the bcrypt library. Scrypt is very similar to bcrypt. It's a little bit newer. I would say it's a little bit better at authentication for web development. So if you're using bcrypt currently, swapping over to scrypt should just be a pure upgrade. There are obviously differences to them, but it really doesn't matter for the purposes of this video. Just know scrypt is a secure way of hashing password-related information. Then what we want to do is we want to take our password. I'm going to be calling the normalize function on it. All this does is it makes sure that our password, if it has any weird characters inside of them or anything like that, it normalizes it to a specific value that can be used within our hashing algorithm to make sure it always hashes exactly the same. So we're just going to normalize our password to hash it, and then we want to make sure we pass along any salt related information. So we're going to pass in our salt, and then we're going to pass along the value of 64. This is just going to be the length of the actual key here that we're going to be using. And then finally, we get a callback, which is going to have an error, and it's going to have our hashed password. Now this is a callback based function, and I prefer to work with promises. So we're going to convert this to a promise by returning a new promise here. And this promise is going to take in a resolve and a reject, just like that. And then here, the very first thing we can do is if we have an error, well, we can just reject that error just to make sure if there's an error in our hashing, we understand that. Otherwise, we can resolve, and we can take our hashed value here. And if we hover over this hash value, you see that it is currently a buffer. So we need to convert that to a string. So we're going to call toString, and we're going to convert it to a hex-based string. So it's easy to store in our database. And then again, we'll normalize that to make sure any weird inconsistencies are fixed. So this right here is all the code we need to write to actually hash our passwords. Let's get rid of the stuff down here, and now we have that function in place. Now to use this, we can come over into our actions here, and we can make sure as long as we don't have a user for that email, what we can do is we can get our hashed password, which is just equal to calling hash password, just like that. And we're going to be passing in our password, which is data.password, and we can pass it in some salt. We'll make our salt more secure in just a little bit, but I want to show you what this looks like by just adding in a console.log here for our hashed password. There we go. So now I'm going to go over to our sign up page. We're going to make sure we pull up the console. I'm going to type in some bogus information. It really doesn't matter. And for my password, I'm just going to type in the word password. And we're going to click sign up and see what that does. If we come over here, you can see it rendered out this really long, completely random string. Now, if we go back to our sign up page and we type in the exact same password again, password, and we click on sign up, you're going to notice that these two strings right here are exactly the same. And that's because what's happening is we're passing along the exact same salt every single time. You want your salt to be entirely random every single time that you generate it to make sure if you hash the same password, it comes out as two different values. So we're going to create a function, which is just going to be called generate salt. And the only purpose of this function is to create a completely random string. So we can use the crypto library for that again. So we can say crypto.randomBytes. We can say we want to get 16 bytes, which is essentially 16 random characters. And we can convert that to a string, just like that. And it's going to be a hex-based string. And of course, we're going to normalize that just like everything else. So now this generates us completely random values that we can use as our salt. So here, instead of passing along a hard-coded salt, we're going to pass in this generate salt function, just like that. Now, if I hash the same exact password, you're going to notice it's different. So we're going to come in here, .com, and I'm going to hash password. We're going to click sign up, and you can see it gets this particular string. Now, if we do the exact same thing again, hash the exact same password and sign up, you're going to notice that these two strings are now entirely different, and that's the purpose of our salting. So now that we have access to all this information, we need to make sure that we save the salt for the user, we save their password, and we save their user inside of our database. So we can come into here, we can take our code that we had written. I'm just going to copy down the actual code we need. You can see we're getting our salt, and then we're hashing our password from the data using that particular salt to get our hashed password, just like we had done before. Next, we're getting our user, and we're passing in all the information for our user directly into it. So we're passing in our name, our email, our password, and our salt. Now we're currently getting some errors, and that's because our hashed password type is set to unknown. This is a bit of a TypeScript issue, and that's because here, this hash, when we convert it to a string, it doesn't really know what's going on and what it's resolving to. So we need to make sure we tell TypeScript, hey, we're resolving this to a promise that returns a string, just so it knows that this is always going to be called with a string. Now if we go back into our action here, you can see that removed our error because now this actually has a type of string and we have this user object. Now I'm going to wrap all of this inside of a try catch because we know that if this fails, it throws an error. So we want to make sure that we just throw in a catch here that's going to catch any error related stuff. And if we have an error, we can just return down to the user that we are unable to create their account, just like that. Now if we have a user here, we want to make sure it exists. So if user equals null, we're going to again return that we are unable to create their account. Otherwise, once this is done, we now have created a brand new user in our database with the salt, with this password, email, and name. All we have left to do is to make sure we hook them up with that session cookie. Because if we go back into our diagram here and I scroll up to the section on sign up, we've essentially done the sign up form. We've done the verification of all their data. We inserted the user. All we need to do left is this create user, insert session, and all of the other stuff related to the user session. Now, creating a user session is really not too complicated, but I'm going to break this out into its own file, again, because I want to separate my Next.js code from my more core related code. So let's create a quick function. We'll call it create user session, just like that. We'll make sure that we throw in an await here because we want to wait for this particular thing to finish. And we're going to pass it in our user because we want to be able to store things such as their email or their ID or their role inside of this user session. Now let's go ahead and we're going to create that function real quick. So we'll go into our core section. I'll create a brand new file called session.ts. We want to export a function with that particular name, and we know it's going to be taking in a user with some user related information. Now what we want to determine is what we want to store inside of our session. Generally, you want to store a small amount of information inside of your session. Something like the user ID and their role are probably the most common things you're going to store in the session. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a schema, and this schema is essentially going to store just that information. It's going to store an ID, which is a string, and it's going to store a role, which is either admin or user. And that's coming from our user roles, which is defined in our database schema. So now we can say that we want to infer the type here of session schema. So we're just making sure we pass in a user that contains this particular information. And to make this type a little bit easier to work with, I'm going to bring it out into its own type. We'll call this user session, just like that, and it's going to infer that type. And here we go, a user session. So to create a user session, all we need to do is pass along something that has an ID and a role attached to it. Then we need to save that information inside of the cookies. Now, normally in Next.js, you can just use the cookies function. But again, I want to keep most of this code as separate as possible from Next.js. So I'm actually going to pass in an object that contains what we need to use for our cookies. And we're going to give that a type of cookie. There we go, cookies. Now this cookies type is essentially just going to use the Next.js cookies object. I'm just going to paste down the type that I'm going to be using for that. It has a set function, which again is just like the Next.js cookies. It has the get function, which allows us to get something, and the delete function. And these are essentially just like how the Next.js cookies work. If you were building this system entirely in Next.js and you weren't worried about swapping things around, you could just not worry about passing the cookies in, and you could just directly use the cookies object inside of Next.js. But again, I want to make sure that this works even if you're using a framework that isn't Next.js. So now in order to create a user session, all we need to do is to create a brand new generic ID that we can associate with them, and we want it to be entirely random. So we're going to create a session ID. We're going to use that exact same crypto library that we used before. So let me make sure I come up here and we're going to import that. There we go, from crypto. And down here, we can get some random bytes. I want to get a large amount. I'm going to say 512. And that's because you generally want your session to be large and random because you don't want it to be something people can guess. Because if someone has access to your session ID, they are able to authenticate as you, which is obviously not great. So we're going to come in here, convert this to a hex value, and then we're going to normalize it just like we did with everything else. So now we have a random ID we can associate with our user. We just need to store that inside of our cookies. We also need to make sure that we store this inside of our database, because if you remember from this diagram over here, whenever we create our user session, which essentially that's what we did right here, we need to make sure we store it somewhere. You could store it in a database, but I'm going to show you how to store it inside of Redis in case that's the route you want to go, since it'll usually be quite a bit quicker than storing something in a database. So I have a Redis client already created. I showed you this a little bit ago. It's just using Upstash, but you can use whatever Redis client you want. It really doesn't matter. And we're going to come in here with our Redis client. And what I want to do is I want to set a value, and this value is going to be session : and then we're going to pass in our session ID just like that. Then we need to pass in our user information, and you would think we could just pass the user in like this, but I want to make sure that the user object I pass in only contains an ID and a role and nothing else. So I'm actually going to come in here with our user schema. And I believe I called that session schema. There we go. I want to parse that. I'm going to pass in my user. And this is just going to make sure it only saves the ID and role portion and strips out other things like the password and the email and all those other properties we don't want. And then I can specify what I want the expiration to be. So I'm going to save this inside of a variable up top so we can kind of keep this expiration everywhere we want it to be. So I'll just paste that in. This is just called session expiration in seconds, and essentially this is 7 days worth of seconds. So all I've done is I made it so that this particular session is going to work for 7 days. So if I log in today and I come back 3 days from now, it's still going to have me logged in on the system. You could change this to be shorter or longer depending on your particular needs, but we're just going to keep it at 7 days. It's a relatively good number. So here I can pass that in, and now this is going to delete itself automatically from our Redis storage in 7 days. It's another nice thing about using Redis versus a database is we can delete this automatically after 7 days, while with a database, it's a little bit more tricky to do that. So now once we await that to make sure it's finished, the very last thing that we have to do is to set our cookie. All we want to do is save this in a cookie. So as you can see over here, we save it in a session cookie. That way we can send it back down to the user. So we're going to pass in our session ID as well as all of our cookies information, and we're just going to create a function called setCookie. And the only reason I'm breaking this out into a function is because we're going to use this in multiple places. So our session ID is a string, and our cookies is just going to be that cookies type, but specifically, we only care about the set object of it. So I'm just going to make sure I specifically say it's only the set portion. Now the way that this function works is it's just going to take that cookie, it's going to set a specific key for it. Let's just create that up top here. You can call this whatever you want. I'm going to call it custom auth session ID, or you could just call it, for example, session ID. Either one's going to work. We'll just keep it as session ID. There we go. So we can come down here. We gave our cookie a name. We gave it a value, which is our ID. And then we're getting in a bunch of different properties. The important properties is you make sure that it is secure and HTTP only. That means that this cookie is only sent on HTTPS request, so secure request, and it's only accessible on the server. So HTTP only means it's only accessible on the server, which means you cannot access it on the client in JavaScript, which is important because you don't want other people to get access to this. And secure just makes sure it's always encrypted when it's sent along. This is Kyle from the future. I want to make one really quick update for you. You'll notice that I have same site set to strict in this code. It should actually be set to lax, L-A-X. And the main reason for that is because with a lax cookie, it allows us to access that cookie on our server, even if we're redirected from a different page. And this is very common with OAuth. For example, when you do an OAuth sign-in, you are redirected from, for example, Discord or Google to your own site. And you'll notice actually when we get to the OAuth sign-in in our application that it doesn't quite work as I expect, because we actually come and show our page as logged out until we refresh the page, and then it shows us as logged in. Now this is something I fixed at the very end of the video, but I wanted to mention it here just so when you're following along and writing your code that you know that this should be set to lax instead of strict. Finally, we can set an expiration date into here, and this is again just going to say that this expires in 7 days from now. The way expirations work in cookies is it requires a number instead of a date. So here we're just taking the current timestamp, adding these timestamp for whatever the duration is in seconds, and since the timestamp is in milliseconds, we multiply by 1,000. So all this code does is it sets a cookie on our user that'll get sent back down to them. So now we can make sure that this is an asynchronous function, and we have the ability to create user sessions. So inside of our action, all we need to do is pass down the cookies from Next.js. And this is asynchronous, so if we await the cookies, we can pass that in. And if we import this function, you can see everything is hooked up properly. So we've, first of all, made sure that we don't already have a user. Then we created a salt and hashed their password and saved them in our database. After we saved them in our database, we created a brand new user session, and that session is getting sent down to our user, so they'll have that inside of their cookies. So now we can see exactly how this works. I'm just going to open up our page here and make this a lot smaller. There we go. So I'm going to go to sign up, and I'm just going to put in some boilerplate information. We're going to say I'm going to sign up as Kyle. We're going to say my email is test@test.com, and we'll just type in password as my password. And when I click on sign up, you can see that it's going to be processing a bunch of information behind the scenes, and it maybe looks like something's not quite working because it's taking a long time. Let's come in here. Oh, it's just making sure it's posting. Failed to find server action. This request might be from an older. Okay, so the issue is we have a cached version of our Next.js page. Let's just remove Next.js, get rid of our cache. That should hopefully fix the problem related to that. And now when I click sign up, it should go through the process of actually compiling that sign up page and posting to it. And again, we got a failed server action. So let me refresh my page down here, and that should fix the problem. Just some cache and related stuff in development, nothing to do with our code. There we go. Sign up. And you can see that it actually signed us up, and it even said, hey, make sure you check your password because the password of password is not a very good password. And if I inspect my page, this will be how we know if this works or not. If I go to my application tab, you'll see inside of the cookies section, we have a brand new cookie. This cookie has session ID. And if we look at the value, you can see it's just this massive string down here at the bottom of my page. This is what our actual session ID is. But the important thing is that session ID is stored inside of our Redis database. and then it has information for our user inside of there. And to show you that this is working, we can close out of this real quick. We can go over to our Redis instance, and you can see that inside of our Redis instance, we have this session ID here, which is a really long key, and it has the value, which is the ID of our user, and the role of that user, which is just user. So now anytime we access our session information, we're going to be getting this back from our Redis instance. So now let's go ahead and actually render our user, because right now we're not actually getting our user information, because if we go to our application and our page, you'll notice everything's hard-coded. We need to still implement this particular section, and we just need a way to get the current user. So let's create a function for that. We're going to go into our Next.js section, and we're just going to create a section called server, or we can just call it current user. Actually, it would probably be better, .ts. And the only thing that we're going to do inside of here is we're just going to export a function called getCurrentUser. It's going to be using the React cache, and this is just to make sure that if we call this function multiple times in one page load, it only ever gets called one time. It's going to access our cookie information, and it's going to be calling getUserFromSession, which is a function we're going to create inside of our session section. So inside that session file, we're going to create a brand new function for getting our user. So we can say export async function, get user from cookie or from sessions, and it's going to be taking in our cookie information. Now for our cookies here, we can say we want to get our cookies, and we can pick specifically the properties we want, which is just get, because we don't need to set anything. And down here, we specifically only need the setter, so we might as well hard code that to be just set, so we don't need to pass along extra information we don't need. And now we can get our user from the cookies. This is actually quite easy, because what we can do is we can say cookies.get, and we can get this based on that session key that we created. And we can say that we want to get the value property from here. And this is going to give us our session ID. So all it's doing is it's taking the cookie, which we already looked at when we inspected our page. It's taking this cookie value, and it's figuring out what that is from our user. If we don't have a session, well, then we just need to return that we have no user. So if our session ID is equal to null, then we just return null. Otherwise, if we have an actual session, that means we have a user and we want to get that user. So I'm going to create a function called getUserSessionById, and we can create that function inside of here. And I don't even need this to be an asynchronous function, because all of our asynchronous code is going to go inside of here. So we're going to create that function getUserFromSession, just like that, and it's going to be taking in a session ID. There we go. So we can say our session ID is a string. And inside of this function, I want to get our user from Redis. So we're going to say raw user is equal to await. We're going to call our Redis client.get. And we're specifically going to be getting the session at that session ID. So this first section that we did up here when we got our user is we got the session ID from their cookie. Now that we have the session ID, we access our storage, whether it's Redis or our database, to get the user information from it. Let's make sure this is an async function as well. So now we're getting that information from Redis. The next thing I want to do is I want to take my session schema, and I want to safely parse this information. So we're going to pass in our raw user, just like that. And this is going to return to us a success property. It's going to return to us our data, and we're just going to rename that to user. So if we do not have a success, well, that means that whatever was stored inside of our Redis client, whether it was blank or not, it was just invalid user information. So we're going to return null because we have no user at all. Otherwise, we're going to return our user down here. And to make this a little bit simpler, I can just say success, we're going to return user, otherwise null, just like that, and we can return this information. There we go. And I just want to make sure that I name this function the correct thing. There we go, getUserSessionById. And now with that done, if we come all the way up to here, we essentially got our session ID, and then we got our user information from our session ID, and this is going to return to us an ID and a role, or it's going to return null if it can't find any information. So instead of our getUser function here, we can just get our user from session just like that, and that's going to return to us our user information, and we can use that here. So we can say const user is equal to getCurrentUser, there we go. Make sure that we await this particular code, and now we have a user right here. Now currently, if we look at this user, it only contains an ID and a role, and we're expecting to get the name information down here. For now, I'm not going to worry about that. We're just going to call this our full user, and instead of name, I'm just going to put our ID for now, and I'll just put a little bit of a comment inside of here, just like this, to do fix. Let me make sure that I comment this properly. There we go. So we're just going to make sure to come back and actually fix this and paste in their name. But as you can see, now we get our user ID as well as the role of that particular user. Now, if I were to come into here and I were to go to my application and I were to delete this value right here, that is essentially the same as logging out. When I refresh my page, you'll notice now I'm logged out. So the next thing we need to work on is our sign-in logic, as well as making the log out button work. So let's go back into our actions here. We've created our sign up entirely done. We can get rid of the to-do for that because all of our sign up logic is done. Now let's work on our sign in logic. The very first thing that I want to do for when a user is trying to sign in is I want to determine the user that we're trying to access. So here what I'm doing is I'm doing a database query to get the user based on email, and I'm getting all the information I need. For example, my password, the salt, their ID, their email, and their role. Essentially all of the user information that I need. Then if my user is equal to null, I return that we're unable to log in because we cannot find a user with that particular email. If we have a user with that email though, we need to check to make sure the password that they passed in is correct. And we're able to use the salt that we created in our sign up process. Right here, you can see we created that salt and saved it on a user. We're able to use that combined with our password to make sure that everything works properly. So again, once we have our user, the next step is to compare the password of our user. So we're taking our hash password and passing in their password. We're taking the password that they typed into our form, and we're taking the salt, and we're going to make sure that all of these values are exactly the same. If the value of the password is not correct, we just return that they're not able to log in. Otherwise, we create a user session exactly the same as what we did down here. So the only thing we really have to implement is this compare password functions, and we'll do that inside of our password hasher right here. So we can just come up, we'll say that we want to export a function called compare passwords. Now the props of this function are the longest part of the entire function. We just take in the password, salt, and hash password, and all three of those are going to be strings. So the password is the thing that they type into our form. The hashed password is what's saved in our database, and the salt is also what is saved in our database. So the first thing I want to do is I want to take in our password that they input, and I want to hash that as well. So our input hashed password, this is the thing that they type into our actual form. All we do is we hash our password with the password and the salt, just like that. Make sure that this is an asynchronous function. There we go. So now we have the hashed version of the password they typed in, as well as the hashed version of their saved password, and all we need to do is check to see if they're the same. You may think, okay, well, we can just come in here, input hashed password equal to hashed password, and that's going to work just fine. But the problem with doing it this way is that this introduces something called a timing problem, because the more equal these passwords are to one another, the quicker or slower that your equals function may run. So instead, we actually have a function that allows us to do a timing safe version of this. So we can say crypto.timing safe equals. Essentially, it doesn't matter what the passwords are, how they're hashed. This function is always going to take the same amount of time to do this equality comparison to protect you from timing-based attacks. So here, what we can do, we need to pass in two separate buffers. So all we need to do is just convert our code to a buffer. So we can say buffer.from. We can pass in our input hashed password, and we know that this is in hexadecimal format, so we can get a buffer from that. And we can do the exact same thing for our normal hashed password, just like that, convert it to a buffer from hexadecimal. And now this is going to compare these two values in a way that does not open us up to any timing-based attacks. So if I give that a quick save and I import that function right here, now we've essentially implemented everything related to sign in. We first got the user based on email. We then compared that the password they typed in is the same that they signed up with, and then we created a user session for them. So let's see if this actually works like we expect it to. I need to make sure I get rid of any different imports that I don't need. There we go. So we can go to sign in. Here, I just need to type in the email that I used, which is test@test.com. I need to type in the password, which is just password. And if I click sign in, you can see it redirects us to this page and we're signed in. And if we check our application for our cookies, you can see we have a brand new session ID inside of our cookies. And in our upstash, you can see here we now have a brand new instance inside of here. Now I'm going to delete this old one here that we manually deleted just to get it out of there, because now I want to show you how logging out works, because we want to remove our session both from our Redis instance as well as from our cookies inside of here every single time we click on this logout function right here. And luckily, this is actually really easy to do. So the first thing we need is some way to remove a user session. We have the ability to create, we have the ability to get, we need to export an async function called remove user from session. There we go. And this is going to take in our cookies. So we're going to get our cookies from up here, and we specifically need both the get and the delete method inside of our cookies. So we want to just pick both of those options from there. So now inside of here, the very first thing I need to do is just to get our user session. So we can kind of copy the code we did up here. We want to get our user session, and if it doesn't exist, just return. And the next thing I want to do is I want to take our Redis client, and I want to call the delete function specifically on our session for this particular session ID. So I want to delete this data from Redis. Then the next thing I want to do is I want to take our cookies. I want to delete our cookie as well. So I'm not only deleting my Redis data, but I'm also deleting my cookie data to make sure it's nowhere saved anywhere. So it doesn't matter where the session ID is. If they have access to it, they're not going to be able to access our information because we've deleted it from everywhere inside of our database and inside of the user's cookies. Then we can go into our actions, and our action for logout is dead simple. We're just going to call that function. So we're going to call remove user from session, and we're going to pass it in all of the cookie information. That's all we need to do to implement the logout function. Really, all it does is just delete everything that we have saved for the user. So we can minimize that down because we're done with all 3 of these functions. And when I click logout, you'll notice it immediately logs me out. When I inspect my page, you'll notice there's nothing saved in my cookies. And if I go over to my Redis instance, you can see it deleted that information from my database. Now, to show you how the automatic expiration works, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into my session section, but instead of having a 7-day expiration here, I'm just going to have a really short expiration of 5 seconds. Actually, let's make it 10 seconds, just so it's long enough for us to see what goes on. Now I'm going to sign in with that exact same information. Make sure I spell everything correctly there. And I'm going to click sign in, and you can see that we are currently signed in, but this data is only valid for 10 seconds. So after 10 seconds, when I go to refresh my page, it's going to completely sign me out. You can see if I refresh right now, I'm completely signed out. And if I go to Redis, you'll notice nothing is saved inside of here because it gets automatically deleted after 10 seconds. And again, if I inspect my page and I look, there is no cookie at all because it instantly deletes that. Now, obviously you want the user to be logged in for longer, which is why we're going with 7 days. Now that covers kind of the basics of this email password authentication, but there's a few extra things that we can add in that I think are really useful. So for example, one thing that I want to do is we go into this current user function. It's very basic. It only just allows us to get our current user and only gives us the ID and the role because that's what we save in our session. But sometimes we may want to have more information. Like here, we want to access their name, or maybe we want to redirect the user if they're not signed in to the sign in page. So inside of here, I'm going to revamp this code quite a bit. I'm going to paste in what the code looks like, and then I'll explain exactly what's going on because it's quite complex, but the only reason it's complex is because of TypeScript. So you can see here that we have a type called full user, and we have a type called user, because half the time I want to get my full user, and half the time I just want to get my user role and ID. So if we scroll down, I have this function here to get my user from the database. It takes the ID from our session, and it gets all of our important user information, such as our email and our name, which are not stored inside of our session. Now inside of our code that we have for our actual function, all our getUser function does is it takes an object with full user and redirect if not found. So if we pass in with full user true, it should get us the user from the database with their name, email, and any other information. If we pass in redirect if not found is true, that means if our user is not signed in, we should redirect them to the sign in page. So here you can see we're getting our user from the session. That's just like what we were doing before, and we're making sure we pass in the cookies. Then if our user is null and we want to redirect them if they're not found, we redirect to the sign in page, otherwise you just return null. Finally, if we're supposed to get the full user, then we're going to get the full user from our database by saying get user from DB, just like this. And if we specifically wanted to get our full user and our full user is null, we're going to be throwing an error because we should never have a null user in our database when we have an ID for that user inside of our session. So we're just going to throw an error in the case that happens because it shouldn't happen. And then we're going to return our full user. Otherwise down here, we return our normal user. And to make this code a little bit simpler, what I can do is I can move this down into here, just like that, just to clean up our code a little bit so we're only getting the full user if we actually need it. Again, this section right here should never happen. If it does, we should be throwing an error. And the really nice thing about this is now we're able to get our full user information, we can do the proper redirects, and all of that stuff is going to be type safe because of this very complex TypeScript code here, which is just a bunch of function overloading. All I'm doing is I'm saying, hey, if full user is true and redirect if not found is true, this is the return type. If this is true and false, this is the return type. Same thing here and same thing here. I'm just hard coding the return type for each of our individual variable declarations. This is not ideal, but when you're writing complex code that's at like a library level, sometimes you need to write these complex TypeScript types. The really nice thing about doing it this way though is that it's very easy to use as an actual author. So let's go into our page section here, and now I can call getCurrentUser, and I can pass in with full user true. And if I look at my type here, you can see that it has name, ID, email, role. If I were to remove this or set it to false, you can see that my type has automatically updated to only the information I have. If I say that I want to redirect if not found, set that to true, now you'll see immediately here that this is no longer able to be null, and you also see it redirected me over here. So in our case, we just want to get a full user true. So down here, we can replace this with our user's name and close out of all this information. So really all I did is write some complex TypeScript code to make sure our types are correct, but the actual logic for our function was quite simple. As you can see, it's only like 10 lines or so of logic, and then we have 50 lines of TypeScript code because sometimes that's just how TypeScript is. And again, we're wrapping this inside of a cache to make sure if we call this multiple times in one instance, it only ever accesses our database and our cookies one time. So now let's go ahead and sign in real quick to make sure everything is still working. Click sign in. You can see it has properly signed us in, and we get our name showing up, which is really great. So we at least know everything is working. And right now I can go to private page and it allows me to access that page. But if I sign out, I'm still able to access this page. I'm going to click log out. I'm I'm going to go to /private, and you'll notice I can still access this page, which is clearly not what I want to have happen. Now there's a few different ways we can fix this. If we go over to our private page, you can see here I'm getting the current user. Right now it's not actually doing anything, but I could come in here and I could say get current user, and I could say redirect if not found, set that to true, and now that'll automatically redirect me. So I can say const current user is equal to that. There we go. If I give this a save real quick, make sure I actually throw in an await. There we go. If I give that a save, you can see I'm automatically redirected back to the sign-in. This works great, but sometimes you may not want to make this particular check on the actual page that is private. One example of that is our admin page. You can see we're not getting our user information anywhere in here. And if I go to /admin, you can see I can still access this information just fine, while I should have to be a signed in admin user to access it. And this is where the idea of doing a middleware check comes in instead. Now it's entirely up to you how you want to do your authentication, whether you want to do your checks on the page level or where you want to do them on the middleware level or somewhere in between with a combination of both. I'm obviously going to show you how to do both. I've already showed you how to do it on the page-based level, so now I'm going to show you how to implement it using middleware. So let's kind of minimize all of this down. In our source folder, we're going to create a file called middleware.ts. Now to get started in this middleware function, I'm just going to paste in some code here real quick. This is some pretty basic code. All we have is a middleware function that we're making sure we export. It's specifically called middleware. And down here, we're making sure we skip anything that we don't need. I actually copied this directly from Clerk. Essentially, it's just skipping all of the more Next.js related pages, and it's only going to run the middleware on our actual pages that we care about, which is our actual application. Then I have up here our different routes. So we have all of our private routes as well as all of our different admin routes. And that way we can run our middleware based on these particular things, whether we want to redirect the user or not determines if they're on the private route or an admin route. Now to make this even easier to work with, I'm going to create a separate function called Middleware Auth. This is where all of our authentication is going to go. It's going to take in our next request, just like that. And inside of here, I'm going to be checking, are we on a private route? Are we on an admin route? And so on. So if we have a private route is included in our request.nextURL.pathname. There we go. So if this current path is a private path, well, I want to get our user, which is going to be calling await get user from session. And we're going to pass it in our request.cookies, just like that, because we can get our cookies from our request. So this is making sure it's accessing our user from the session. So this is going to return to us, as you can see here, either their ID and their role, or it's going to return null. So if our user is equal to null, well then what we want to do is we want to turn a response that is going to redirect them to the sign-in page. So we can say new URL, and this new URL is going to go to /signin, and it's going to go from the request.url. So all this is going to do is it's going to redirect them to the sign-in page. So this is what happens if it's a private route. Now we want to see what happens if they're on an admin route. So we're going to come in here. If it is an admin route specifically, again, we're going to get the user, and if the user is null, we're going to redirect them to the sign-in page. Then we need to make sure we check the user's role. So if the user.role is not equal to admin, well, then what we want to do here is redirect them. But in this case, I'm just going to redirect them back to the home page like this. So we're just going to redirect them back to the home page because they're already signed in. They're just trying to access a page that they don't have access to. So we'll redirect them back to the home page. So now we have this middleware auth that we can call inside of here. So we can say here, our response is going to be equal to calling middleware auth and passing in our request. Make sure that we await this particular function. And this is going to return to us a redirect response, or it's going to return to us nothing at all. So if it returns to us nothing at all, we're just going to take this as a next response.next. Essentially, that means do nothing at all and just proceed like normal. So we're either going to redirect them or we're going to proceed as normal. Now, if I just do that and do a quick return, that'll already solve our problems. So if I do a return of my response here and I refresh this page, we should be redirected back to the home page or redirected to the sign-in page, depending on how we're signed in. Now you can see I'm redirected to the sign-in page because I was not signed in. Now I'm going to try going to the private page to see if that redirects me. So I'll type in private up here and we should get redirected back again. And you can see we did. So now let's sign in as our test user, just like that. Click sign in and I'll make sure I actually typed this in right. There we go. I just had my password typed in incorrectly. Now you can see I can access my private page just fine. But if I try to go to the admin page, it redirects me back to the home page because I'm not an admin user. My role is only user. So let's go ahead and implement this toggle role function before we finalize what our middleware is going to look like so we can see how that would work. And this function is actually very easy for us to implement up here. You can see right now we have our user. We need to make sure that we update them and get them. So we can come in here. We can say get current user. And we can say that we want to redirect them if they're not found. That way we know this user is going to exist. Just like that, you can see it has an ID and a role. Make sure we await that, and now this is going to update our user by swapping what their current role is. So right now this is going to work, but the problem is that I don't actually have this updated in my session. So if I were to click on this toggle role button, inside the database, it has updated my user to have the correct role of admin, but it never updated in my session, as you can see, or inside of here, you can see my role is still set to user. So it's not properly propagating, so we need to make sure we create a function for that. We'll call update session data, and we'll call it update user session data. So anytime that you update the information you store in your session, for example, your ID, your role, or anything else you store in that session, you need to make sure you update your session information. And this will take in our updated user, so our updated role and ID, as well as the cookies that we're going to pass along. And we'll make sure that we call await on this particular thing. There we go. So let's create this function inside that sessions folder, or that session file. Here we go. Export function, just like that. This is going to take in all of our cookie information, so we can copy that in, as well as it's going to take in our user, which is our user session. And for the cookies, it only gets the get function. We don't care about anything else. And that's because really all we're going to do is just get our session like we've been doing before. So we're getting our session, and then I want to update our session, which is something that we did here. So I'm going to copy that code because it's essentially exactly the same. Right here, I just want to update our particular session information. So all that this does is it gets our current session and it resets the expiration date, and it's also going to make sure it updates it with all of our brand new user related information. So now if we give that a save and we come back into here and we save on that, now when I actually toggle my role, it will correctly toggle. So if I click on this, make sure I give it a quick refresh, click on this, looks like it's not quite working. Let's see if we have any errors in our console. Make sure I click on that. It is actually posting this. Let's just make sure this is working by doing a quick console log of our updated user. Updated user. There we go. We'll click toggle role. You can see here it has a role admin. Toggle it again, it goes back to a role of user. So that is working properly. So something inside of here is not working properly. The only thing I can think of is maybe our session ID is incorrect. So we'll just log out our session ID. We'll go on toggle here, and you can see our session ID is being returned. So that is correct, and it should be setting our user. If we come over to our Redis instance, you can see our role is user. And let's just try toggling that again. We come over here, refresh, you can see it still says it's a user. So let's go ahead and go back into our action to make sure, our toggle role, we are passing along the updated user, so that is the correct user that we're passing along the correct function, coming into here, and this is calling that set function. Let's make sure that this is actually returning what we expect it to. There we go. And there we go. Actually, it looks like probably what the problem was maybe just caching with Next.js. So let's go ahead, and to see if it's caching related with Next.js, we're just going to close our server. We're going to delete this next folder up here and restart our server. Sometimes when you do changes in Next.js, especially when you're changing around your middleware, it just doesn't like that. So we'll come in here, we'll give this a refresh, let it load our page. It'll show us what our actual role is, which in our case is user. And now we can click on toggle role, and it should have toggled that role over here. We do a refresh. You can see the role is admin here, and when I refresh, the admin role is here. Now, this is something that we can fix by just moving on a little bit to the next step in our process. So I'm going to kind of minimize down some of the stuff that we've already completed here, just so we don't have to keep mental bandwidth of all this stuff that's open. And what I want to do is I want to focus on updating their session every time that they access our page. Right now, the session expires in 7 days, but what happens if in 6 days and 23 hours, they're still on our site interacting? Obviously, we don't just want to log them out in the middle of interacting with our page. So we want to refresh their session to start over at 7 days every time they do something, every time they log in, every time they click a button, every time they view a page. We want to just reset their session back to normal. So we can go back into our middleware page here. And what we can do is when we get our response, what I want to do is I want to update their session. So we're going to call this function update user session expiration. And inside of here, I need to pass along our cookies. But it's a little bit interesting when we're in our middleware because our cookies is a little bit different. We have our request and we have our response. We need to set the cookie on the response, but we get the cookie from our request. So what I need to do is pass in my own cookie object, which is going to take in a set function, which takes in a key, a value, and options. This is the normal set function we're used to, but the response.cookies.set works a little bit differently. It actually takes in an object, which takes in all of our options, a name, which is the key, and it takes in a value. Essentially, our response.cookies.set works differently than our normal cookies function set. So all I'm doing is I'm mapping between the two of them. So I'm just making sure that they work properly. Same thing here. I'm going to do a get, which takes in a key, and it's going to call request.cookies.get and pass in that key. I'm just making sure I use my request cookies here and my response cookies here. Now let's go ahead and we're going to make this function real quick, and I'll show you how this function works. And again, if you're not messing with the Next.js side of things, this mapping portion you don't even need to do. So we'll go into our session section just like that. We'll come down here. We're going to create this function, update user session expiration, and it gets from our cookies just the get and the set function. Then what I want to do inside of here is I want to get my session just like I've done with pretty much everything else. So wherever I have my session being got, I'll just copy that down just like that. Next thing I want to do is I want to get my user, which is get user session by ID. There we go. Session ID. Then if my user is equal to null, we should return. And then finally, what I want to do is I want to set this information. So we're just going to come up here where we were doing some setting before, and I'm going to paste that down. And we just want to make sure we pass in whatever our user was from our session. So really all we're doing is we're getting our session from the cookie, we're getting the user information from the session, and we're just resaving that inside of Redis to update the expiration date. And then we're going to call setCookie, pass it in our session ID and our cookies to again reset the expiration date on our cookie, because here you can see we're setting our expiration date directly inside of here. So all this function does is reset the expiration date with the exact same data we had before. So now it's just going to make sure it constantly updates that information. Now here, I need to make sure I do an import on that. That'll fix all the different errors that we have inside of here. So now hopefully this toggle row function will work. And as you can see, it is actually properly toggling the information because it's making sure inside of here it's having to do some extra gets to get our user information. Essentially, it's just busting the Next.js cache every single time that we have to toggle our role related information. And the nice thing is, again, we now no longer log people out when they hit that expiration. It needs to have a full 7 days of inactivity before they're logged out. So if they use the site within 7 days, it'll refresh them back to a 7-day window for the expiration. So now we essentially have the entirety of email password-based authentication set up. As you can see, there was a lot of complexity in the code, but the code itself is not too difficult once you understand what's all going on. Once we get it all written, the really nice thing is using the code is really easy. You can see here, for example, we just call getCurrentUser. All the stuff with dealing with session and everything like that, that's all behind the scenes. We never touch that again. All we have to do is just make sure we update their session data if we specifically update something like their role or the ID, but most of the time you're not messing with that information. So really all you have to do is call getUser, and that is going to work for everything. Now, before we start diving into OAuth authentication, because if we look at the diagram here, OAuth is significantly more complex than just normal email-based authentication. I want to show you how you can set up Clerk authentication just to kind of give you a comparison of what the difference is between doing it on your own versus doing it with a third-party tool that's going to provide all this for you. And when it comes to third-party tools, Clerk is really the one that I prefer to use because of how simple and powerful it is. So all we need to do is come into here and we're going to create a brand new application. So we'll just click create application. We're just going to call this one custom auth, and it doesn't matter, we can have Google and email-based sign-in. That's going to work fine. Click create application. And from here, we can just select Next.js, scroll down, and we can just go through these steps one by one. So here we want to install the Clerk library. So we're just going to paste that in. The next thing we need to do is we need to make sure we get our keys and paste them into our environment variables. So I'm just going to copy that and paste those over. So I just pasted those keys inside of my page. Next thing we need to do is we need to update our middleware by using this Clerk middleware. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to take my existing middleware, I'm going to copy it to its own file, and then we're going to paste the Clerk version inside of here. As you can see, I copied a lot of this stuff from here, and it's calling this Clerk middleware function. Then we can wrap our application in Clerk provider. So you can see here we have this Clerk provider we can wrap our application inside of. So we can come into our layout, just make sure we wrap everything inside this Clerk provider, just like that, import it, and then we come all the way up here and make sure I import that. Import Clerk provider from Clerk/Next.js. There we go. So that is making sure that Clerk works in our application. And now we can, for example, use the sign in button and the sign out buttons and so on to actually sign into our application. So if we go into our application on the page here, I'm just going to copy this so we can keep our old version in place. And now I'm going to show you what it would look like if you're using Clerk to do this. So here where we have our buttons, all we would need to do is just say that we're going to have our sign in button, just like that, directly from Clerk. And we can do the exact same thing here with our sign up button. There we go. So now we have our two different buttons that we're going to be using. To get our user from Clerk, we can just say that we're going to get our user ID, which is equal to await and calling the auth function, just like that. Make sure that I import this. And this is going to give me all of the information related to my user. In our case, we're going to get our user ID. And if our user ID is equal to null, then we're going to redirect them to sign in, which again is a function we can get directly from here. There we go. And actually, we don't even need to redirect them to sign in because we don't actually care about that. We can just say here, if our user ID is equal to null, then we render this information. Otherwise, here, instead of rendering out all this card information, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this inside my card header. I'm going to render out the user button that's built into Clerk. There we go. Get rid of all this information. And we'll give that a quick save. So now what I can do is I can go back to my application, give this a quick refresh, make sure I run it. There we go. And this is essentially how you can get Clerk set up in your application. That's just how easy it is to get set up with Clerk. So once we give this a quick second to refresh, you can see here it's not properly detecting our middleware. I forgot to save this file. When I give that a quick save and a refresh, you can now see we have our sign in and sign up button. When I click sign in, it brings me to the sign in page and I can sign in with Clerk. Or here I can click sign up and it's going to bring me to the sign up page. So let's say that I just want to sign up with an email, or actually I'll just use Google in this particular case. So we'll continue with Google. You can see here I can click on an email and then it's going to log me in with that email and I can click on continue. And now you can see it's going to bring me back to this part where I have my user button. I can manage my account. I can do all that stuff directly built into Clerk. Now, if we wanted to make sure we hide things from certain pages, like right now, all of our pages are public. So for example, if I go to my admin page, you can see that this page is publicly available. Same thing with my private page. This page is publicly available. So if I want to make sure I hide these things, I can just come in here. I could say that my private route is equal to create route matcher from Clerk. And I can specify all the different routes that I want to hide from my user. For example, /private, I want to hide that particular route. And now inside of here, I have access to the auth information. And also I'm going to need to make sure I get my request information as well. So now what I can do is I can say private routes. I can pass it in my request information. This will return true if it is a private route. And then what I can do is I can just say auth.protect. Just like that, there we go. And all I need to do is just make sure I wait calling this particular function. And this is going to make sure that anything that is a private route is going to make sure it's completely hidden. The next thing I can do is I could also throw in, for example, admin routes here as well, and I could check user role permission related information, but I'm not really going to worry about that. For now, I'll just throw in my admin route here. There we go. Now if I give that a save and I refresh my page over here, we should get redirected back to the sign-in page. I'll just give that a second. Now it looks like I'm not being immediately redirected back. One thing that I can do is just throw in here a little selector that's going to say, hey, this is going to select anything that starts with /private. That's just going to make sure even if I have nested routes, that's going to get them. Same thing with admin here. Let's give that a refresh, see if that works. And in the last case scenario, we can just restart our development server since we did change our middleware. That may have caused some particular issues. Give this a quick refresh, see if that works for us. And you can see it's not working. And again, the reason for this is because I'm currently signed in. So I need to sign out to actually make this not work. So we'll give this a quick sign out. And now we'll try going to the admin route and you can see it redirects me back to the sign in page. Same thing here. If I try to go to my private route, it redirects me to the sign in page just like I want. Now, as you can see, getting Clerk set up in your application is incredibly easy, which is why it's kind of my go-to when it comes to authentication, especially if I need a more complicated authentication system. Now I'm going to show you how you can work with OAuth specifically from scratch. We're not going to do any of this in Clerk. So we're going to take all the Clerk stuff that we created. We're just going to get rid of that, rename this back to our middleware file. And then same thing here. We're going to get rid of this page for Clerk and we're going to rename this back to just page. And in our layout, we're going to get rid of that Clerk provider. So let's just get rid of all the Clerk related information that we have. And you can see that we're signed in as the user. We can access our private page. We can toggle our role to admin. And now you can see we can access our admin page. And of course, if I log out, I should be able to sign back in as that user. So everything is working as it was before. Give that a quick click. There we go. You can see it's working just fine. And let's toggle us back to a normal user. Now, before we start diving into the code, we need to understand exactly how this authentication system is going to work because OAuth is significantly more complex than normal password and email-based sign-in. So the way that OAuth works is when you're on the sign-in form as a client, you click which OAuth provider you want. So you click a button that says sign in with Google, sign in with Discord, and so on. And that tells our server, hey, this user wants to sign in with Discord. And what we're going to do is we're going to create an OAuth URL. We're going to say, hey, I'm going to generate a brand new OAuth URL for Discord. I'm going to send along a bunch of information, in our case, client ID, redirect URL, scope, all the information we want to send to them, like, hey, I want to get access to this user's email. Here's my ID to show that it's me. You're going to send all that along to Discord, GitHub, whatever your server is, and they're going to generate a sign-in URL. And that's going to get sent back to your user. So essentially your user says, I want to sign in with Discord. You say, hey, Discord, I want to authenticate as this user and I want to get access to their email. it's going to send the user a sign-in page that says, hey, this server wants access to your email and other information. Do you want to allow this? Sign in as Discord if you do. So they're going to enter their authentication email, whatever it is, email, password, they're going to click on their account, whatever it is, and that's going to send along that data to the actual server, and that server is going to do all the verification for us. So essentially, they're entering their credentials, GitHub or Discord or whatever is going to verify those credentials are correct, and they're going to send us a code. Now this code is not very useful on its own. All we do is we take that code and we send it back to Discord, GitHub, whatever it is, and we say, hey, can you actually give us the token to authenticate as this user? And as long as all the information you send them is correct, it's going to send back a token. So you're going to get that token, and then you're going to send that token back to the server and say, hey, now that I have this token that authenticates me as this user, I want you to tell me what the user's name, email, ID, all this other information is. So we're going to get back the user's information, and now we're going to save that in our database just like normal. So we're going to take that information, create a brand new user in our database. That's going to send us back a user ID. And then what we're going to do is we're going to save an OAuth connection. So not only do we need to save which user this is, we also need to save how they signed into our service. And that's because one user could sign in with email password, they could sign in with Discord, they could sign in with Google, they could sign in with GitHub, and I want to be able to make sure it doesn't matter which one of those 4 options they choose, they're still going to get signed in fine. So we first create their user object if it doesn't already exist, and then what we're going to do is we're going to save which authenticator they authenticated with. So this is going to be like, hey, they signed in with GitHub with this particular ID, and then we're also going to create a session. And this session part is exactly the same as all the other logins. So we create a session, we save that session cookie, we send it to the user. Those last 3 steps are exactly the same as before. Really, the big difference all the way at the very top here is that instead of them sending us sign-in information, we're essentially telling them, hey, you want to sign in with Discord? Okay, Discord, give us a URL, it gives it to the user, and this client credential information gets sent directly to Discord, and they just give us a code that allows us to authenticate as that user. So there's quite a lot of additional steps inside of here, but really the actual code to write this out is not nearly as complex as this diagram makes it seem like. Really, it's a 3-step process if you break it down. Step 1 is we generate the URL for the actual authentication. Step 2 is we're going to be getting the code information and sending that along to get a token. So step 1, get an authentication URL. Step 2, get a token based on our code we get sent. And step 3, get the user information. So that's the only 3 things that we need to do. Everything else in the middle is relatively simple to get set up. So let's go ahead and work on implementing that. The very first thing we need to do is to modify our database. So we're going to come into our schema because currently our database schema, all it has inside of it is just our user table. And our user table actually has a required email and password and salt. But obviously, if they're able to authenticate with like GitHub, for example, we don't have access to a password or a salt, so we can't save that information. So I'm going to update our information in our tables real quick. You'll notice our user table stays exactly the same. We just make it so a password and salt are now no longer required fields. They're entirely optional because if you sign in with GitHub, you don't have a password or salt. Next, I make sure I set up a relation so that users can have many different OAuth accounts they sign in with. And finally, for our OAuth accounts down here, we specify all the different providers we support. In our case, we support Discord or GitHub, but obviously if you want to support more or less or different ones, you can change that to your own need. And then finally down here, all we do is we hook up, okay, our user ID links to the user table. So what user is this that's currently hooked up to this OAuth account? Then we have the provider. This is going to essentially be which of these providers up here we want to use. And this should honestly be an enum. So let me change that to an enum. Just like that. So there we go. We have the provider, which is that particular enum. We also have the provider account ID. And that's essentially their user ID on GitHub, Discord, Google, whatever account they sign in with has an ID associated with that. And we want to make sure that we save that information as well. And then finally here, the primary key is just an association between the provider account ID as well as the provider itself. So like the Discord and their Discord ID or GitHub and their GitHub ID. So essentially we're just associating one particular user with one particular OAuth account, and a user can have many different OAuth accounts. So this user could sign in with GitHub, Discord, and all these other accounts, and we're going to save that directly in this table with their user ID, which account they signed in with, and what the ID is on that account. So let's go ahead and migrate our database to include these changes. We can say npm run db generate. That's going to generate a migration for us. If we look at the actual code for this, it's relatively straightforward. Instead of our package.json, you can see here, this just calls drizzlekit generate and drizzlekit migrate. So let's come in here, make sure that we do migrate as well. And of course, I forgot to save this file. That's why nothing generated. So let me just go in here, generate, there we go. And then of course, migrate, and that should hopefully migrate our changes. So now we have those new tables in our database to take advantage of. The next thing we need to do is we need to add those buttons to our sign in and sign up forms. So let me make sure I restart our application. I'm going to make sure that we log out over here. There we go. We'll click log out. And we'll come over to our authentication section inside of Next.js, and we have our sign in form and our sign up form. So if we give it a log out, we just want to add the buttons at the very top. So inside of our sign in form at the very top, we'll just add a div with 2 buttons. These buttons are going to have an onClick event that's going to call a server action that's just going to give us a URL. So OAuth sign in URL for Discord, OAuth sign in URL for GitHub. Essentially, we just redirect the user back to the server for GitHub or Discord. If you remember, that's the very first of those 3 main steps. First step, get the authentication URL and send that to the user. So let me go ahead and make sure I put these on the sign up form as well. They're exactly the same. We get our OAuth sign in URL because the way OAuth works, sign in and sign up are essentially exactly the same. It's going to use the exact same process because they're essentially signing into an account that already exists. So it doesn't matter if they're doing a sign in or sign up, the workflow is exactly the same for us. Now we can go ahead and create this action. We'll just call it an async function, and it is called, OAuth sign in, and this is going to take in a provider, which is our OAuth provider, just like that. And all we want to do is get OAuth URL, and then we want to redirect them to that URL that we're going to be getting. That's all that we're doing inside of this section. So to understand how this works, we're first going to look at Discord OAuth, then we're going to look at GitHub, and then we're going to look at how we can combine them together essentially into one class that's going to work for all the different OAuth providers out there. So let's go over the Discord developer tools right here. And if you just type in Discord dev, it's going to bring you directly to this site. All we need to do is create a brand new application. We're going to call this custom auth. Doesn't matter what you call this particular application. And let's make sure we agree to the terms. We'll create that real quick. And then it's going to allow us to create an application that we can sign into with GitHub or with Discord, I'm sorry. So here we have an application ID, public ID. None of that actually matters. What we need to do is we need to go to this OAuth2 section specifically. And inside of here, we're going to get our client ID and we're going to get our client secret. And we need to store those inside of our env variables. So let's open up our env file here. And I just want to come down. I'm going to create a section for OAuth. And then we'll create a section for Discord specifically. We'll just indent that. And the very first thing I want to have is my Discord client ID. We'll just copy that and paste that directly in here. And then our Discord client secret, we'll just call it, yeah, there we go, client secret. So we'll reset this so we get a brand new one. And if I just do some multi-factor authentication, you can see we get our client secret, which we can paste directly into here. Now, the way I have my environment variable set up is using T3 just for some type safety stuff. So if we come into here, we need to make sure we add in our Discord client ID, which is a z.string.min of 1. I want to do the exact same thing with our client secret. There we go. So we just have access to our different OAuth variables that we created. Now, if we go to the documentation on Discord for OAuth related stuff, so we just go back to our applications, go to the documentation, they have an entire section specifically all about OAuth. Let me just go to the top and search for it. So we can say OAuth, just like that. Here we go. This covers everything you need to know about how to use OAuth. And as you can see, the 3 steps we talked about, we kind of have here. We have our authorized token, which is step 1. We have the get token, which is step 2. And then finally, step 3 is actually accessing the information that we need, which the URL I don't believe is stored directly on here, but we can find that in other places in the Discord API. But these are the 2, step 1 and step 2. Finally, step 3 is get the user information, which we can get from their API over here. Now, in order to create all this information and make it easier to work with, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into our code in the core section. We're going to create an OAuth folder. And inside of here, I'm going to create a base.ts function or a file. And inside of here, I'm actually going to use a class. We're going to export a class called OAuth client. It's going to be a generic type of T, just like that. And in this OAuth client, we're going to have a bunch of information, but specifically, we're going to have our functions for our various different steps. For example, create auth URL is going to be our step 1, which uses this URL right here. So this create auth URL function is just going to take in some cookie information. So we're going to say cookies, and it's going to be that cookies type that we created earlier. And specifically, we just want to get the set function because we want to actually be able to set specific cookie values. And that's because whenever you do authorization with OAuth, if we scroll down in the documentation a little ways, you'll notice this section about state. We need to send along state and then verify that state. And it's just a level of essentially security to make sure everything is working fine. It's not required to send along this state, but it's going to make your code more secure. And you can see here as an example, we send along our client ID, our client secret, and a bunch of other information inside of here, and that's going to be able to verify us on Discord. And the nice thing about OAuth2 is it's the same standard between all different providers. So Discord, GitHub, Google, they all work exactly the same. So this create auth URL function, we can create one time and use it for Discord, GitHub, or Google. It doesn't matter. We can use it for all of them. So for this auth URL, the very first thing that we want to do is we want to use our specific URL. So if we scroll back to the top of the page, we need to get what our Discord specific URL is. And that's right here. So I'm going to copy that so we can at least have that information. We'll just say const URL is equal to, and we'll paste that in there just so we have it. And specifically, I want to turn this into a brand new URL object with that URL pasted inside of it. So let me just come in here, just like that. There we go. So now we have a new URL object because I need to set a bunch of search params on it. So I can say search params.set. And the first thing I need to set is my client underscore ID. And again, this is the same for every OAuth2 provider. You need to pass along your client ID. So we know that that is going to be our env, get that from our server env.discord client ID. The next thing we need to pass along is our redirect URI. So redirect URI. So essentially, this is a URL that points towards Discord right here. And that's going to say, hey, I want to authorize this user. And this redirect URI says, as soon as my user is done authorizing, where do I send them back to? And we want to send them back to our server. I'm actually going to create a simple private getter for this. We'll say private get redirect URL. This is going to return to us a new URL. And it's going to take in whatever our provider is, which in our case is Discord. And it's going to take our environment.oauth redirect URL base, just like that. And this is something that we're going to put inside of our environment variables. So inside of here, I want to make sure that I have a z.string.url. And then inside of my environment variables, here I'll just put that base. And this base is going to point to essentially an API route where we can handle all of our logic. Because normally when you click sign in, for example, it brings us to our server to sign in. Here we want to, after they're done doing our OAuth stuff, redirect back to our server where we can handle all that logic. So we'll say this is going to be localhost 3000/API/OAuth. So this is just going to redirect them back to essentially an OAuth route. And by inside of here, when we go back to here, we are just adding Discord to the end of it. So essentially it's going to go to API/OAuth/Discord. And that is going to be the route we get sent to. And if we do GitHub, it'll be GitHub. If we do Google, it'll be Google, and so on. We'll create that actual route in a bit. It's not super important. For now, we want to get this section working. So our redirect URI is just this.redirect URL. There we go. Now, of course, we need to make sure we convert this to a string to pass it along. So we'll say toString just like that. Now, the next thing we need to pass along in our URL.search params is going to be a standard value of response type. So this response type, we always want to be the exact same value of code. And that's because based on how we're getting this to work, this Discord server is going to send us back a code that we can use to essentially authenticate ourselves as the user that signed in. So we're saying, hey, we want to get the code for this user. Also, we need to make sure we pass along the scope that we want to have. So URL.searchParams.set, and we're going to set our scope. Now our scope is just going to be all the different values we want. Inside of Discord, if we come over here and we actually scroll down, you can see here's a list of all the different scopes. And really the only scope we care about is going to be email, as well as information for like reading the user's stuff. So we just really want to care about identity and email. So in this scope section, we can essentially just take our scopes that we're going to have, which is identity and email, just like that, and they're just separated by a space. Now I mentioned how we had a state section that we had to worry about and other stuff like that. I'm not going to dive into the state section yet because, like I said, it's optional and extra, so I'm going to just make sure that what we have right now is working before we dive into the other stuff. So let me just convert this URL to a string to return it, and now we have this create auth URL function that we can use. So what we can do inside of our action is we can just say that we're going to get our URL here, which is just new OAuth client, just like that. And we want to get the auth URL. And of course, here we need to pass along our cookies. Even though we're not using them yet, we need to pass them along. And that'll work just fine. Now, obviously, this OAuth client is not super specific, or it's not super generic. It's just specific to Discord, but we'll fix that in a little bit. I just want to see if what we have right now is working. So let's go ahead and save all of our different code that we have here. We're going to make sure that we import this function. There we go. It's working there. Let's import the function here as well. And now if we go over to our application, we give this a nice refresh to go to the main page. You can see invalid environment variables. It looks like it's trying to access environment variables that do not exist. So let's make sure that we have all of our environment variables defined. This one is called Discord client ID. This is the URL base. Let me make sure I named them correctly. That's probably the only issue I had. So here we have the OAuth redirect URL base, Discord client secret, Discord client ID. That all looks correct. I think one thing we may need to do is add a slash to the very end of this. That should hopefully fix some of our problems, but we still obviously have our invalid environment variables. My next best idea is just to simply restart our server, because sometimes, like I said, Next.js caches some things weirdly. That should potentially fix our issue. Give it a quick second, and it looks like that did fix our issue. Now, if we go to sign in, we have the ability to sign in with Discord. And when I click on this link, it's going to redirect me to this particular section. But of course, we have an invalid scope identity. If I go ahead and look at the Discord developer tools, you can see it's identify instead of identity. So I just typed that incorrectly. So let's make sure this is identify instead. And we're going to go back and we're going to make sure we now click the Discord button again. And you can now see our redirect URL is not a well-formed URL. So there's something wrong with our redirect URL. So let's go ahead and look at our environment. I spelled localhost incorrectly. There we go. Now, hopefully, if we go and click on this, we should be able to get this. And of course, we still have an invalid URL. So let's go ahead and go into our base section and make sure this is all correct. Redirect URI. That does look correct. This is our redirect URL. Let's just print out what our redirect URL is to see if that's maybe the problem. Console.log this.redirect URL.toString. There we go. So now hopefully when we go to this particular page, it should print out our URL. And that does look like a correct URL to me. I believe the reason for this error is actually because we never set up a redirect URL. So we need to go back into all of our different applications. Let's go ahead and find that auth, which we called custom auth. And that's because whenever you do OAuth related stuff, what you need to do is you need to make sure, let me find the OAuth section, you need to make sure that you specify all your redirect URLs manually. So here, HTTP localhost 3000/API/OAuth/Discord. That is our OAuth URL that we want. So we just need to make sure we manually specify this on every single thing we do. And this is something that you have to do no matter what, whether it's GitHub, Discord, whatever, you always have to manually specify your redirect URL. So now we can come in here and let's see if that actually works. We can click on Discord and now you can see it saying, hey, custom auth wants to authenticate and sign in as me. And what we can do is we can click on authorize down here in the bottom, and that's going to send us back to that redirect URL. You can see up here, API OAuth Discord, and it sends along a code. And this is the code that we can use to get all of our user related information. Essentially, that's moving on to step 2. We've completed step 1, which is to get the code by sending them the auth URL. The next step is essentially to use that code to get our user access token. And then finally, step 3 to get the user information. So the very next thing I want to do inside this OAuth client is to create another function. And this one is going to be called fetch user. And it's going to take in that code. And it's also going to eventually take in some state information. So we're not going to worry about that right now, though. So I'm going to leave that off. And it's also going to take in some cookies, which again, we don't need right now, so I'm going to leave off. Really, all we care about right now is the code information. We'll come back with the state section in just a little bit. So with our code, all we want to do is we want to fetch information for the user based on our URL. So if we go back to Discord and we go to the documentation again for OAuth related stuff. So let me make sure I just search for OAuth. And we can scroll down just a little bit. You can see we have the URL for tokens that we want to make a fetch request to. So we can say fetch, and we want to fetch that specific URL. And this request is going to be a post request. So we can say method post, just like that. And we also need to pass along some header information as well. So first of all, our content type, we're going to be accepting an application, we're going to be sending application x www form URL encoded. And this is just standard protocol for OAuth. You're going to be sending URL encoded information. And we're going to be accepting JSON back. So we're going to say application/JSON. So this is going to give us JSON data back, and we're sending URL encoded data to them. Next, we need to be able to pass along all of our body related information. So let me clean this up, got to get rid of function there. There we go. Now we can go along and pass our body information. And this is where we're going to pass along all the information that we need to be able to get the specific token. So the body must be passed along as URL search params, because again, we're passing along URL encoded data, so we must pass along as URL search params. We need to pass along our code, and then we need to pass along a bunch of information proving to Discord that we are the same people from before. So we need to pass it along our redirect URI from before, the exact same one. So we'll get our redirect URL, convert that to a string. There we go. We also need to pass along what we want to get. So the grant type essentially says we want to get an authorization code. This is going to be the exact same for all OAuth2 providers. We're saying, hey, we have a code, we want to send that to you, and we want you to give us authorization information for that user. We then need to pass along our client ID, which in our case is env.discord client ID. We then need the client secret, which is our env.client secret for Discord. And there we go. That's all the stuff we need to pass along for now until we start dealing with state and other stuff like that. So what this is going to do is it's always going to return to us everything related to the access tokens. So we're going to get back our response, and we're going to convert that response to JSON at the very beginning. And then that's going to give us some raw data. And what we want to do is we want to parse that raw data using Zod. So we can say data success error is equal to this dot, we'll call it token schema, and we want to safe parse our raw data. So let's create a token schema. We'll come all the way up to the top of our class. We'll say we want a private read only token schema is equal to z dot, and this is going to be an object. And this object is going to contain all the information that we want to get back from our access token. And this is standardized information that's the same for every OAuth provider. They're going to provide you quite a bit of information related to the scopes you have access to, your access token, your refresh token, and a few other things. But really all we care about is the access token, which is going to be a string. And we care about the token type, which is also going to be a string. There we go. These are the only things that we care about on our token schema. So down here, we're going to get that data back. So if success equals or is not equal to true, so if we don't have a success, then we're going to throw some error. I'm just going to create a new error called invalid token error, just like that. I'm going to pass it along my error, and I'll just go ahead and I'll paste down what this invalid token error looks like. As you can see, we're just going ahead and we're creating a custom error just so we have the ability to throw these custom errors, and then we can listen for these custom errors if we want to, but we're just throwing that error. Otherwise, I want to take this and return our access token, and I want to return our token type. There we go, just like that. And I'll also throw in a little bit of a console log so you can see what this raw data looks like. So console.log raw data, because this is the same for every single OAuth provider. So right now, this code is really for fetching particularly our token. So I'm going to put this into its own function called fetch token, just like that. And we'll return this information at the very top. There we go. And of course, get rid of that function keyword. There we go. And I'll make this a private one because we don't want to be able to access this from outside of our function. And there we go. This is just all the same code we had before, but now we can call this up here. We can get our access token, and our token type is equal to calling fetch token with our code. There we go. And of course, this dot fetch token. That's exactly what we want. And now we have access to these two pieces of information. So let's go ahead and make sure we actually call this in our API. So inside of our app, we're going to create a new folder called API/OAuth/Discord, because that is where we're calling this actual code. But instead of calling it /Discord and /GitHub, I'm actually just going to create one single route. And this route is just going to be called provider. Essentially, it's a dynamic route. And we can come in here with a page.tsx, or just ts, sorry, there we go. And here we can export a async function called get, which is going to take in our request, which is a next request. And it's also going to take in our params. And this params is where we get that provider from. So this params, just like that, is going to return to us a promise. And the promise has a provider ID, which is a string. There we go. So now we have all that information, and we can use that inside of our function by just saying const provider, which we'll call raw provider, because we don't know if this is the correct provider. It's not been verified by anything. Is going to be getting back our params. And we can console log provider, just like that. And if we come over to our page and we give this a quick refresh, you can see it should be logging that information out, but of course it's not working. It says default export is not a React component. That's because this should be called a route, not page, since I'm making a route handler, not a page. There we go. And you can see here, provider is not defined. That's because we called it raw provider. There we go. So now if we give that a refresh, you can see no response is returned, but it is actually logging out Discord, which is exactly what we want. So now we just need to get all of our information. For example, we can get our code, which is request.nextURL.searchparams.get code, because we know that's in our URL, and it's always going to be there. This is standardized practice. Then we can get our normal provider, and that's just going to be calling z.enum with our OAuth provider, enum, just like that. And we're going to parse that with our raw provider. There we go. And this is just going to make sure that the type of this has been correctly updated to what we want. And this should be called OAuth providers, not the enum version. There we go. So now you can see the provider is going to be of type Discord or GitHub, and if it's not, it's going to throw an error. Then we can check to see if our type of code is not equal to a string. Well, that means that our code is not what we expect it to do. So we should probably redirect the user. So we're going to redirect them to a failed sign-in page. So I'm just going to copy over what the redirect looks like, paste it down. Essentially, we're redirecting them to our sign-in, but we're going to be rendering out an OAuth error, which says failed to connect, please try again. So let's make sure on our sign-in page, we actually throw and show this error. So inside of Next.js, inside of our components, inside the sign-in form, we need to handle what this error should look like. And actually, we need to do it up in the apps section. So auth, inside of sign-in, here's where we should handle that. I'm just going to paste in the code for this because really all that we're doing inside this section is we're getting some search params, we're getting the OAuth error, and if we have an error, we're rendering it on the page. Just as a way to show the user, hey, there was an error when you tried to log in, and they show them what the particular error is. So now let's go back to our actual API for this route. We have access to our provider information, so we can actually use that information now. Also, instead of this saying provide ID, it should just say provider. There we go. That should clean up the problem. So now we can try to fetch our user. So we can just come in here. We could say const user equals await new OAuth client. And we specifically want to fetch the user, and we need to pass along our code. And that should hopefully get our user. Right now, we're not doing anything, but we can just console log our user, just like that. And now if we give this a refresh, we'll probably not get this to work because our code is most likely expired. As you can see, we're getting an error and it's throwing our new invalid error token. And again, that's because our code has expired. The codes don't last very long. So what we should do is we're just going to go back a few steps, refresh this, click on Discord, and we're essentially going to create a brand new code by clicking on authorize. And now you can see it brought us to this page, and we should have some information being logged out. You can see we get our token type, our access token, our expires in, our refresh token, and our scope information being sent to us. Now, if you wanted to do more with Discord's API rather than just get the user's information, you would need to save things like the refresh token and the access token. But in our case, all we want to do is get the user information. So all we need is the token type and the access token, which is what is being returned from us inside this fetch token function. We have our access token and our token type. The next step is to access the the Discord API to get our user information. Now, in order to do that, it's going to be different for every API. This is the one section that's different from every API. Everything up to this point is the same for every OAuth provider, but for each API, you need to determine which route to hit to get the user. In Discord is the /users/@me route, and it's going to return to us a user object, which has all of this different information inside of it. Really, for us, we only care about a few things such as the ID, their username, their global name, and stuff like that. That's like all we care about, and their email, of course, wherever that's at inside of here. We want to get that as well. So those are the only things that we care about for this particular user. So what we need to do is to create a schema that defines what our user should look like. And this is, again, different for every single provider that you use. Discord, GitHub, they're all going to be different. So we'll come in here, private read only. This is going to be our user schema. And this object is what we're going to create. It's going to have an ID, which is a string that is required, as you can see here, an ID that is required, a username that is required, a global name, which is optional, and then finally we have our required email section. And it's going to be calling that Discord API, which is the @me API. If we scroll down quite a ways, you can see /users@me is the API we're going to be calling. So now let's go down to fetch user. We have the access token, we have the token type. Let's go ahead and actually make these particular calls to get the information. So we want to make a fetch request. This fetch request is going to go to that API, which is API/users/me. Again, that's the Discord specific one. We also need to make sure that we call this API correctly. For example, we're going to need to pass along our headers, and in the headers, we need to pass along our authorization. And this is where we pass along our token type, and we pass along our access token. There we go. And this should be pretty much standard across all different providers. They should all take in your authorization header exactly the same because, again, that's kind of OAuth standard stuff that's working. So it should take in these authorization headers just like this. Then we want to get our particular information. So we're going to get our data. We're going to convert that to JSON. Then we're going to take our raw data. There we go. And with our raw data, we, again, essentially want to do the exact same thing that we did down here. So I'm just going to take this, copy it, paste it up, but instead of doing our token schema, this is going to be our user schema. So it's going to get our raw user data and it's going to pass it along to our schema. We're going to have an invalid token error. This should actually be an invalid user error, just like that. And we'll create that down below here. Just copy that, invalid user error, invalid user, just so we have some custom errors that we can see what's going on. And now we can return all of our user related information from here. So down here, we'll just do a quick return of our data. We'll say const user is equal to awaiting that. There we go. And if we look at our user, it's going to have an ID, a username, an optional global name, and an email. So down here, we can return this as essentially what a new user object is going to look like. So our ID is just going to be user.id. Our email is user.email. And then finally, our name is going to be a little bit interesting. It's going to either be user.globalName, or if that is not defined, it's going to be user.username. There we go. So if they don't have a name defined, we're just going to use their username as the name that we return from this API. So now fetch user is going to get all the information we need to save this inside the database. So if we just make sure we come over here, close out all these files that we don't need, we can come back into this page section. Whoops, that's the wrong one. I want to make sure that this is the page we're inside of. Now we're getting our user, we're logging it out right here. Everything is saved. We're most likely going to need to refresh our token because it is definitely expired by now. So let's go to Discord. We're going to authenticate and authorize. And we should hopefully see, if we look inside of our console, that it's going to print out our user information. So as you can see, it's printing out our ID, it's printing out our user's email, and it's printing out the actual name of the user, which is exactly what we want. Now all we need to do is make sure we save this user inside of our database, and we've got most of OAuth set up. And when we move on to the more complicated stuff into GitHub, it's going to be pretty easy because we have the backbone in place. So up inside of here, we have our user. We'll call this our OAuth user, just so we don't get confused. This one is specifically our OAuth user, and we want to create an actual user next. So we'll say create user, which is await connect user to account. And we're going to pass in our OAuth user, just like that. We also want to pass along the provider that this is for. So we'll pass in our provider like this, so we know is it Discord, GitHub, and so on. So we'll create this function, connect user to account. This is going to take in our OAuth user, which is going to be an ID, an email, and a name. ID, email, name, and then finally our provider, which is an OAuth provider. There we go. And inside this function, we want to create a database transaction. So we'll create a database transaction because we're going to essentially be creating two different things. And if either of them fail, we want to make sure that we roll back the other one. There we go. So first of all, we want to query our user table to see, is this user already in our database or not? Because if they're already in our database, well, then what we want to do is we want to create this OAuth connection for them if it doesn't exist. And we want to make sure that we get that user to sign them in. So we can say that we want our user to be equal to getting our user from the table. So I'm just going to copy the code because this is pretty self-explanatory code here. All we're doing is we're querying our user table for the particular email that came from this user. And then if we have a user, then that's great. If we don't have a user, then we need to create one. So if our user equals null, that means this is the first time they've signed up for our application. So we want to create a brand new user. So I'm going to copy the code over for this again because we've seen this before. All we're doing is we're inserting into our user table our email and our name directly from our user information up here. So whatever we get back from Discord, GitHub, and so on is what we're inserting into our table. And then we're returning the ID and the role so we can use that, and we're saving our user right here. Then what I want to do is I want to insert this new OAuth provider. So I can say await, and again, I'll copy this over just like that. So what I'm doing is I'm taking this OAuth table, I'm adding in the values for our provider, so Discord, so on. This is the ID associated with our Discord user. And then finally, this is the user ID associated with our current user. If they already have essentially a Discord or GitHub or so on provider in our database, we do nothing, we just ignore it. Otherwise, we create a brand new one. Now, the reason for this is because this logic right here is both for sign in and for sign up. So obviously, if they're signing up, we create a brand new user and we create a brand new connection. If they're signing in, well, they already have a user, so we have this section right here, and this will just do absolutely nothing at all. So this logic can work in both scenarios, sign up and sign in, which is why we're making sure we account for both particular scenarios. And then down here, we can finally return our user and make sure we return this up here. So essentially what's happening is we first get our user. If it exists, then what we do is we make sure we create a new connection between that user and their OAuth provider. If the user doesn't exist, we create a brand new one and then again set up that exact same connection. So that's all it takes to set up our user and connect them to their account. The next thing that we need to do is we need to create a user session. And this process is exactly the same as what we did inside of our normal email password login. We just want to pass in our user and we want to pass in our cookie information. Make sure we call await on that, pass in our cookies, and we're good to go. Now I'm going to wrap this inside of a try catch. So we can just say try, move that down, catch any error that we get, console.log any error that we get. And actually, let's make sure we console.error it so we really know that there's a problem. And then we're going to redirect them back to essentially the sign in page and say, hey, there was an error trying to sign you in. Otherwise, we'll redirect them to the home page. There we go. And that's pretty much everything related to this function entirely done. Let's go ahead and actually re-authenticate again. So we'll come in with Discord here. I'm also going to make sure that we get rid of some of our console logs because we no longer need them. So here we had a console log for our raw data. Here we had one as well, I believe, but it looks like we got rid of that. So here we go. We're going to authorize our user. It's going to redirect us back to our page. It's going to save everything in our database, and now we're redirected back to the home page. But it looks like something didn't quite work because, as you can see here, we don't have any session. Oh, we do have our session. It did look like it worked. Now, to show you that this is actually showing up in our database, I'm going to come in here, npm run db studio. That allows us to access our database information, which is accessing the Drizzle studio behind the scenes. Give that a quick second to start up. We'll open this up. And if we go over to our OAuth accounts table, you can see we have a user ID, we have Discord, we have the provider account ID and other information. And inside of users, we have obviously our user information here for the user that was just created with the name WebDev Simplified, the ID here. Password and salt are null, which is great. So we can go ahead and we can close this. We can go back to our application. And now I want to work on some of the more advanced features of OAuth before we start implementing GitHub. But once we implement GitHub, it'll be incredibly easy because we'll have all the legwork done for essentially everything we want to do. The main things that I want to implement is I want to make sure we have our state for checking state, as well as for dealing with code challenges, which is another advanced feature inside of OAuth. So the first thing we're going to deal with is state. And essentially state is just a random string of characters that we send to Discord, and they're going to send us back the exact same random string of characters, and we just want to make sure what we sent them is the same thing that they sent us. It's just a security measure to make sure that when we send off an OAuth request, some third-party malicious person isn't sending us back a response. We're making sure that the response is directly coming from Discord to just authenticate even further that everything is working fine. So we're going to come in here, we're going to say state is calling create state and passing it in our cookies. Now this create state function is incredibly simple. I'll just paste it down so that we can take a look at it. First of all, I'll need to make sure I implement our crypto library up here by importing that. There we go. So we have crypto imported. Now we can scroll back down to take a look at this. We just need to save this state cookie key and this cookie expiration in seconds. So we'll just go to the very top and paste those back in here. I also have a code verifier cookie key. We'll get to that in just a second. That's like step 2 of the advanced authentication. But here we just gave this state cookie a name, and also we gave it an expiration of 10 minutes because we don't really need this to last very long. So now if we scroll back down, really all we're doing is we're creating a completely random 64-byte string of characters, and then we're saving that in our state. Specifically, the important thing here is I'm making sure I set same site to lax. The reason I need to set it to lax is because the request is coming from Discord server to our server. If this was set to strict instead, it would not send along the cookie because cookies in strict only work when you're going from your server to your server. By using lax, we can make sure it's going to work when they send the request from their server to our server as well. So now that we have the ability to create this state, all we need to do is we need to make sure we pass this state along. So we can just set it as one of our parameters, url.search params.set state, and we're going to set it to our random state that we created. So we're telling Discord, hey, here's our unique state, and we saved it in the cookie so we have access to that on our user. Then when Discord makes a request back to us inside of here, we're going to be getting our state inside of our search params. So we're going to get state back just like this, and we need to make sure that this state is a correct and valid state. So to do that, whenever we're fetching our user, I want to make sure that this takes in our state as well as our cookies. And this cookies, I can just copy from up here. We want to specifically get the get method from our cookies. I'll expand this a little bit so it's easier to see. So now what we want to do before we even bother fetching our tokens is we want to validate that we have a correct piece of state. So we can say const is valid state is equal to await validate state. And it's going to take in our state and our cookies. And then if is valid state, there we go. If it is not valid, then we want to throw a new invalid state error. There we go. And we can create that invalid state error down here. Invalid state error. It doesn't take anything in the constructor, and it'll just say invalid state. Now to validate our state, the function is very simple. All it does is it's going to get our state from the cookies and check to see if it's equal to the state that gets passed to us from Discord. It really doesn't get any simpler than that. So now if we scroll back up, that's all we need to do to make sure that everything related to state is entirely done inside of our application. So let's just make sure that this actually works. We'll go back into our route here. We need to make sure we pass in our state and our cookies. There we go. And of course here we're getting an error potentially on state because we want to make sure that state is a string. So if state is not a string, then we're going to also make sure we redirect with an error. So now let's see if this works. We're going to log out of our user. We're going to click sign in with Discord. We're going to be sending along that state information. It's going to send us back that state information. And you can see here, it looks like it refreshed us here. And of course, there's a little bit of an error. It's not quite showing our user right away. We'll get that fixed in a little bit. Don't worry about it. But at least we do have that particular section working on our code. And just to prove that this is working as we expect it to, what we can do is we can come in here and we can pass in some bogus data for our state. And we should see that it now no longer works. So we sign in, we click on Discord, and when I authenticate myself as a Discord user, you'll see it says it failed to connect because our state did not match up between what we sent them and what they sent us. So this is just an extra level of security. Another level of security we can do is a code verifier. So we go back into our OAuth client. A code verifier works very similarly to our state. So when we created our state, to create a code verifier, it's going to be exactly the same. We create a random bit of string and we save it inside of our cookie. The main difference is the way that the code verifier works. The state is essentially verified on their server and then they send us back the state. The code verifier is going to be kind of similar, but we send them along a particular code, they send us back a code, and again, we do more verification with it to make sure that it's working. So we can come all the way up here and we want to create a code verifier. And we can call that create code verifier function and pass in our cookies. Then we want to send them along a hashed version of this. So we can say url.searchparams.set. We want to send them a code challenge. Make sure I spell that correctly. There we go. Our code challenge. And we want to take our crypto. We want to hash this value using SHA-256 because that is what is used by this particular OAuth authentication. We passed it in our code verifier to hash it. And we want to make sure that we return this as a base 64 URL encodable value. So all we've done is we've taken this random string of values and we hashed it, essentially a one-way encryption. Then what we want to do is we want to tell OAuth which of these hashing algorithms we're using. So we're going to say that our code challenge method is going to be equal to S256 because we're using SHA-256 as our encoding algorithm. So we're going to tell them that's what we're using. So we're essentially saying, hey, Discord, we're sending along a hashed version of this code and we're hashing it with this particular algorithm. They're going to store that on their server, just like how we store the state on our server. Then when we send them a request to get our token, we're going to send them the code verifier and say, hey, here's this thing, hash it on your side and make sure it's the same as the thing I sent you originally. Again, it's making sure that all the requests are purposely going back and forth between me and Discord, and there's no third-party person interfering in between. That's the whole idea behind these different code challenges. So then we need a function that allows us to get this data back from our cookie because creating it sets it in our cookie. So to be able to get that data, we can create a getCodeVerifier function. All this is going to do is it's going to get it from our cookies. If it doesn't exist, it throws an error. Otherwise, it's going to return our code verifier. And to create this error, we'll just copy this error right here because essentially it's the exact same thing, but this is going to be invalid code verifier. There we go. Code verifier. Perfect. That's all we need to do. So now we have the access for getting the code verifier. And again, all we need to do is send that along when we're trying to get our token related information. So down here inside of our body, we can say code_verifier is just equal to get code verifier. Make sure that we await that. And actually, we don't need to await that. That actually takes in cookies. So I might as well just pass in my code verifier here, which is a string. Pass that right there. There we go. And then up here, when we're fetching our token, we can call get code verifier and pass it in our cookies. There we go. So that's just going to make sure that our code verifier works. And again, this should all work properly if everything's hooked up. So we click on Discord, and when we click on sign in down here, it should authorize us properly, and it's making sure it's checking all those different codes. And again, if I were to pass in some bogus data here for my second value, we should see that we get an error. So let's click on sign in, click on Discord, and we should get redirected back with an error because our things did not match. As you can see, failed to connect, please try again. Again, that's because our verifier did not match the specific value that's being sent along. So that's all we need to do to get the complicated portions of the extra security measures in place for OAuth. So let's go ahead and make this more generic because right now we have a lot of Discord stuff hard-coded inside of all of our code. So I actually want to make this a generic function that actually takes in a constructor. So we can come in here with a constructor that's going to take in a lot of different values, but we need to figure out what those values are going to be. Now, I'm just going to copy over what these values are. I'll explain them in a little bit. We'll remove this user schema here because we actually have our own user schema defined up above. But essentially, we need our provider. That's pretty straightforward. Is this GitHub? Is this Discord? Is this Google? We need our client ID and our client secret. Again, pretty straightforward, as well as the scopes we're going to be accessing. Then we need our URLs for our 3 different steps. What URL do we use to get the authentication URL? What URL do we use to get a token? And what URL do we use to get the user? We also need to determine our user info, and that's because every single OAuth API has a different user API with different data that it returns. So our schema just determines what data we have returned from us, and then our parser determines how do we take that data and turn it into an ID, an email, and a name. So this is all stuff we've already messed with before, but we're just making it more generic. Then finally, our token schema, that doesn't change at all. Now inside of our constructor, essentially we just need to pass in all of this information. So I'm just going to take our constructor, I'm going to paste it down, and again, it takes in all of these values with these types, and all it does is set them up one-to-one. So really all this constructor does is it just takes all of this data in and it uses that data. Now what we can do is we can replace our hard-coded values of Discord by saying, for example, this.provider. Here, this URL right here is for our authorized URL. So we can say this.urls. And we want to get our auth-based URL. Here is going to be our client ID, so we can get our client ID. Down here we have our scopes, so we can say this.scopes. This is going to be an array, so we just want to join that array with a space in between all the different values. That should be everything we need to do inside of this section. Let's remove this extra console log since we don't need it anymore. Now we can move down into here. Again, this is going to be our URL for our user. So this is our urls.user, just like that. Here our user schema is our userinfo.schema. And down here, we just want to return this.userinfo.parser, and we're going to parse whatever our user is, just like that. And I believe, what did I call this? I called this user just like that, so that should work fine. Let me close out of that, and there we go. So essentially all we're doing is we're taking our object and converting it to something that can be used by our application. Down here, we again need to get our urls.token for our token URL, and here we need to change around which these URLs are. So this is our client ID, and this one is our client secret. There we go. And that should be every single thing that we need to do to essentially make this entirely generic. There should be nothing, if I search for Discord, there's literally nothing in here related to Discord. So now we have an entirely generic OAuth class that we can use. Now what I want to do is I want to create our brand new thing over here. And this one is going to be for a Discord section. So we'll say discord.ts. And what this is going to do is it's going to export a function called create Discord OAuth client. There we go. This is going to return to us a new OAuth client, just like that. And this OAuth client is going to take in a provider, which in our case is Discord. It's going to take in our client ID, which is coming from our environment variables. Whoops, I got the wrong environment variable. Dot Discord client ID. We need to have our client secret, which is environment.discord client secret. We need to get our scopes, which we know is going to be identify, and it's going to be email. We need our URLs, and I'm just going to copy over our 3 URLs since we've already seen what those 3 URLs are. And I might as well just copy the rest of the information because again, this is stuff we've already typed out before. So for example, here you can see that we have our user info schema, which is the schema that's returned to us by Discord. And then we have a parser that takes that schema and converts it to an ID, a name, and an email field. Lastly, let's just add in the last bracket there. And now we have our full Discord OAuth client. Now what we can do is go back into our base, and essentially I want to create a really simple function. I don't even need to export these classes here. I don't know why these are exported. There we go. We don't need those exported. Really, the only thing we need to export is our OAuth client, as well as a way to get a client based on a provider. So this right here is a really simple function called getOAuth client. It's going to get us a Discord client if we pass in Discord, or it's going to get us a GitHub client if we pass in GitHub. For now, we're going to comment out the GitHub section because right now we don't actually have a GitHub client. So we'll just do a quick return there. And then finally at the bottom, we just have a nice little type safety thing. So like if we forgot to place a disk or a GitHub in here, you can see we get an error that says, hey, we forgot to add GitHub up above. So that's why it just makes sure we include all of our different types. So now anywhere we're creating a new OAuth client, we can replace that with getOAuth client. So let me just do a quick search for new OAuth client. So here you can see we're creating a new OAuth client. Well, what I want to do is I want to replace that with getOAuth client and pass it in whatever our provider is. So we can pass in our provider just like that. And we can make sure, we might as well do it up here. We're going to say OAuth client is equal to calling that particular function right there. And let's make sure we import that. There we go. Right now it's giving us an error essentially saying it could be undefined. That's because right here we're returning undefined. So for now, I'm just going to return a Discord one for both. Obviously, we'll change this to GitHub in a little bit, but for now, we'll just make it so that works. Now you can see that removed our error right here. Now the next place that we're using this is inside of here, which is perfectly okay. And then finally, inside of our actions, we just want to get our OAuth client. So we'll say auth client equals, and that is called get OAuth client with our provider. There we go. And we can use that right here to create our authentication URL. That's how simple that is. And now it doesn't matter if we type in GitHub, Discord, whatever, it's going to make sure that it gets the right one based on this simple switch statement right here. So now let's actually see if this works. Let's make sure we get rid of any of these imports that we don't need. There we go. We also looks like we have an error somewhere else inside of our code. Let me make sure I clean that up in particular. Oh, of course, right here is where we have an error. The reason we have an error here is because now we can create users that have null passwords. So I just want to make sure if we're signing in with a user and a password, or an email and a password, that our user.password is not equal to, or is equal to null, or our user.email, or I'm sorry, salt is equal to null. There we go. So if we have a null password or salt, that means that we never signed in with an email password. So obviously we're going to return that they're unable to log in. So we're just going to fix that error right there that we had. So now that we've cleaned this up, let's make sure that it actually works. We'll click on Discord, and we should hopefully be able to authorize as the Discord user. And if I just give that a quick refresh for a second, you can see it says user web dev simplified role of user. So now let's go ahead and implement GitHub as well, and I'll show you just how easy it is. I'll just copy over this Discord one. We'll come in here with GitHub just like that. And this is going to say GitHub OAuth client. And let's just make sure that in our base, we're returning the OAuth client for GitHub. There we go. So now if we go back into this GitHub file, we can just close out of everything else, and we just have this to focus on. Obviously, our provider, we need to change to GitHub, and then we need to set up what our environment variables are going to be, our scopes, our URLs, and then this parser information down here. So to do this, we just want to go over to GitHub, and what you're going to do is you're going to want to go to the settings section. So just click over here, and then you want to click on settings right there. That's going to bring you to this page. You want to scroll all the way down to developer settings, and specifically you want to click on OAuth apps. Now all you need to do is create a brand new OAuth app. Type in whatever your name is. We're just going to say custom auth. We don't really need to worry about this homepage. I mean, ours is just localhost, so we'll say localhost 3000. We need to put in whatever our redirect URL is. So that is going to be, let me paste this URL, /API/OAuth/GitHub. We always need to make sure that we have this. And specifically, we do not want to toggle enable device flow. Device flow is specifically for client-only applications, and we obviously have a server, so we're not going to check that checkmark. So then we can register our application. You can see we get our client ID, client secret, and so on. So let's add that information to our environment variables. So we're going to come into our env here. We're going to get our section down here, GitHub. We're going to have our GitHub client ID. Paste that in there. We're going to generate a brand new secret here. Once we generate that, you can see we can copy this right here. So we'll just copy that GitHub client secret, paste that in there, and now we have all the information we need specifically from GitHub. All we would need to do is then go into the GitHub documentation to figure out what their auth URL is and to figure out what their token URL is. So if we come over here, you can see we have authorizing OAuth apps directly in the GitHub documentation. You scroll down, you can see here, we get the URL for specifically getting the actual authorization URL. If we scroll down a little further, you can see we have the access token section. And then if you scroll down even further, we can use that access token to, for example, to get user information. So again, it's the exact same three-step process. We just needed to make sure we got those three URLs. So now we can use those three URLs directly inside of our application, as well as we can determine what scopes we want to get. And all of this information is directly inside of the documentation for exactly what we want to do. So let's go ahead into our environment variables and make sure we include these new environment variables we just created. We have GitHub client ID, and that's again going to be a string. And then we have GitHub client secret. There we go. Now we can use those inside of here, which is going to be our GitHub client ID, GitHub client secret. For our scopes here, we're going to have user, email, and we're going to have read user, and this should be an array of string values. There we go. Same thing here with the Discord one. This should be an array. There we go. So now we have those. For our URLs, I'm just going to copy them over. We already looked at how we can find those, but you can see we have authorize, we have access token, and we have user. Again, all three from the documentation. And then we need to determine what our user info is going to look like. Again, if you go into the documentation, it'll give you a detailed schema on exactly what this data is. But you can see we have an ID, which is a number, a name, which is a nullable string. We have our login, which is a string, and we have our email, which is also going to be an email. So for our ID, all we're going to do is convert the ID to a string. For our name, we're either going to get their name or we're going to use their username, which is their login field. And then finally, we're going to convert the email to the email field. And that right there is everything we need to do to set up GitHub OAuth in our application. As you can see, once we set up all the legwork in the base, creating a brand new OAuth provider is incredibly simple. And now what we can do in our application is I can click that I want to sign in with GitHub. You can see all this information, click that I want to authorize. It's going to redirect me. And now if I just give it a little refresh here, you can see that I'm signed in as the user, Web Dev Simplified, with the role of user. Now you may have noticed that at certain points in the application, that if I was to sign into the application, it actually showed me as signed out. You can see here when I click authorize, it shows me as signed out when I first get to my application. The reason for that is because I'm accidentally storing some of my cookies as strict cookies when they should be lax. So if I just do a quick search here for strict, there we go. You can see specifically my same site property is being set to strict when I set my session cookie. I actually want to set this to lax. The reason why is the same exact reason I used lax when I was using my OAuth authentication, because when I'm being redirected from Discord or GitHub to my site, if the same site is set to strict, I don't have access to that cookie, and so they have to refresh the page to show up as logged in. But by changing this to lax, the cookie is available right away, which is definitely what you need for authentication. Now the next logical step after authentication is authorization, and I already have a full deep dive covering that. I'll link it right over here. And if you found a lot of this a little bit overwhelming and you want a simpler way to do authentication, highly recommend checking out Clerk, the sponsor of this video. They'll be linked down in the description. They're one of my go-to services for simple authentication. Now with that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.